He died by the river. He slipped. He hit his head. The water engulfed him. And he woke up under a lilac sky, ankle-deep in water that glowed and smelled of wet metal. A fishing rod is clenched in his hand. Ahead, a black and blue expanse stretches to the horizon, and in the mist above it, something the size of a bus is moving. Dan Markett sits down. His head is buzzing. His fingers check the line on their own. The blood knot is tight. The reel is in place. The box of flies is in his pocket. Everything is wrong. Everything except the rod. He knows this 7-foot stick better than his own face in the mirror. The last thing he remembers. A wet rock. A blow to the back of the head. The Madison River engulfing him. And then nothing. And here he is. Dan stands up. His legs are wobbly. He steps back from the water and lets go of his ankle. The water is warm, thick, sticky like diluted syrup. He's worked on rivers for 20 years and knows water by touch. This water is foreign. But it's water. So there's a current, there's a bottom, there are fish. Otherwise, where would the shadows come from? He won't think about it. Thinking is dangerous right now. To think is to admit that he doesn't understand where he is or what has happened to him. And Dan solves problems one at a time. First, the fish, then the questions. He ties a small Adam's fly to a size 14 hook, secures it with a double clinch knot. His fingers move on their own. 20 years of muscle memory isn't erased even by death, apparently. He steps to the water's edge and reads the surface. That's what he does best in the world. Ripples run from right to left. The current is from the north, weak. The water swirls around the concrete debris. There's a riffle there. The fish would be right there, in the calm behind the obstacle, where it can wait for the current to bring food. He casts 30 feet. The line whistles. The line lays perfectly. The fly touches the water, and the water responds. A second later, ripples spread out around the fly, small, curious. Something below is looking at his fly. Dan freezes. His breathing is steady. He's waited like this 1,000 times. The bite comes 12 seconds later. Soft, cautious. Dan sets the hook with his wrist. Got it. The rod bends. The pull is light, a small one. He lands the fish in half a minute. It hangs on the line, and Dan stares at it. It's a fish, sort of, about the size of his palm. A silvery body, fins like a perch, and 4 eyes on its head, 2 on the sides, 2 on top. All 4 are looking at him. The fish isn't struggling, it's just looking. Beneath the scales, something pulses faintly blue. He removes it from the hook. Young, still growing. He dips his hand in the water and spreads his fingers. The fish wags its tail and disappears into the black-blue depths. His fingers tingle. The warmth lingers on his skin. Dan sits down on a rock and dries his fly. All right, they're a fish. The water is unfamiliar, but the fish are biting. That's something. And then, from the left, a low horn blares out of the fog. A siren. A tugboat's horn. Someone's alive. Walls emerge from the mist. Roofs. Lights. The city stands on a cliff half a kilometer away, and between it and Dan lies a strip of black water. He reels in the line, slings the rod over his shoulder, walks along the shore looking for a way to people. The rocks are slippery, covered with something bluish. He slipped once and died. He doesn't want to do it a second time, though he isn't sure if he made it all the way the first time. The shore leads to an old concrete dam. Rusty rails run along it. 2 men stand behind sandbags, spear guns, heavy ones. One raises the barrel and shouts. Dan freezes and raises his hands. The fishing rod sticks out over his shoulder. The second one comes closer, young, a scar across his eyebrow. He looks at Dan, then at the fishing rod, then back at Dan, asks where he came from. From the shore. From which enclave? Dan doesn't know the word. The guard exchanges a glance with his partner. He asks what's on his shoulder. A fishing rod. The guy looks as if there's a live dragon on Dan's shoulder. Why? To catch fish. Both are silent for 3 seconds. Then the young man says that Dan is either crazy or lying, because nobody catches those creatures with a fishing rod. It's suicide. Dan doesn't argue. He asks to be let into the city. He needs water. Drinking water. His mouth is dry. The young man says clean water costs money. He has no money. Then there's nothing for him to do in Port Haven. And just then, something heavy splashes in the water behind the dam. Both guards flinch. Their hands turn white on their guns. They're afraid of the water. Dan sees it as clearly as he sees the current. Every splash makes them flinch. He says he might be useful, that he knows how to work with water. The young man stares at him for a long time. Then he leads him to the pier boss. But if Dan turns out to be a cult spy or an Aqua-Prime agent, they'll throw him off the breakwater. And his fishing rod, too. Dan nods. They head toward the city. Walls of concrete and steel, barbed wire and flickering electric fences on top. Beyond the gates, a narrow street. Houses made of shipping containers stacked on top of each other. People under tarps. Tired faces. Patchwork clothes. Children playing in the dust. Someone is grilling fish on a barrel-top grill. Ordinary fish, not the four-eyed kind. Graffiti on the walls. Clean water. Canister exchange. Hunters Guild recruitment closed. Corps inspection and evaluation. Corps. That word is everywhere here. On signs, on posters, on a passerby's jacket. A guard leads him to the pier, a wooden one, over the water of the bay. Winches, rusty chains, hooks the size of a hand. It smells of old fish blood soaked into the planks. A large man in his 50s sits at a table, shaven head, the hands of a longshoreman, a thick magazine in front of him, the pier foreman. The guard says they found him on the shore. No enclave, no papers. With a fishing rod. The boss looks up. He looks at the rod. His eyebrows creep upward. He asks what it's for. To catch fish. The boss leans back in his chair. He says he's seen 1,000 idiots in 7 years. He saw a guy who went to Bone Skull with a bread knife. He saw a woman who lured a catfish with a song. But this is the first time he's seen a man with a fishing rod. Dan is silent. The boss stares him straight in the eyes, asks if he knows how to do anything useful. Dan says he can read the water. What does that mean? Dan says he can tell where the fish are just by looking at the surface. The boss is silent. Then he gives him 24 hours. A bunk in the temporary barracks. A few canisters of water. He won't prove himself in 24 hours. He'll go back behind the dam. Dan agrees. The bunk creaks. The blanket smells musty. 20 other people are sleeping nearby. He lies on his back and places his fishing rod beside him. The bamboo is warm. He closes his eyes and thinks. Four-eyed fish. Glowing water. Shadows the size of a bus. Spear guns. Cores. They catch the creatures for the cores. The cores grant abilities. No one catches them with a fishing rod, because it's suicide. And he caught a four-eyed fish in 30 seconds, and let it go. He thinks about it until he falls asleep. The fishing rod lies nearby, warm in the darkness. Dan woke up to a scream. Someone on the pier was yelling that the third team had returned empty-handed. He sat up on his bunk. The fishing rod lay nearby, warm. Outside the container window, a gray morning. The sky is the same as always, lilac with black streaks. He stood up. He pulled on his boots. He grabbed the fishing rod and went out. The pier was crowded. 3 boats were moored at the dock, heavy, sheathed in metal, with winches and harpoon launchers on the bow. People were unloading from the boats, wet, angry. One had his arm wrapped in a rag, stained with blood. Hunters. Dan stopped at the edge of the pier and listened. They were talking about the silver eel. The creature had taken up residence in the bay 3 weeks ago. 12 feet long, scales like mercury, fast, angry, rips nets, breaks harpoons, has scared away every living thing within a half-mile radius. 3 crews had gone after it over the past week. All 3 had returned empty-handed. One hunter lost 2 fingers. Another nearly drowned when the blade capsized the boat. The pier foreman stood at his desk, listening to the report from the senior member of the returning crew. A large man in his 40s with graying temples. Chen, the Port Haven's chief hunter. 20 years of experience, scars on both hands. He spoke calmly, but Dan could see his jaw was clenched. Marcus said that Polaz had gone deeper, that they needed a heavy net, an electric arc, maybe 2 boats to pin him down from both sides. The pier foreman said there was no heavy net. The last one had been torn last week. It would take a month to get a new one from Dry Enclave. Marcus was silent. Everyone was silent. The slug was sitting in the bay, and no one could catch it. And while he sat in the bay, the other creatures were leaving. The catch was dropping. There hadn't been any cod for 10 days. The town was starting to get nervous. Dan stood off to the side and looked at the water. He wasn't listening to the conversations. He was watching. For 40 minutes he stood at the edge of the pier and read the surface of the bay. The wind was from the southwest, light. The ripples were small and even. But near the northern pier pilings, the ripples were different, slightly larger, slightly more uneven. Something was disrupting the current, something big. Standing in the depths and casting a shadow in the flow, Dan looked at that spot. The water around the northern pier was slightly darker than everywhere else, by half a shade. A man who hadn't spent 20 years on the rivers wouldn't have noticed. Dan noticed. He estimated the depth by the color of the water and by how the light reflected. 4 meters, maybe 4.5. The creature was standing on the bottom, not moving, waiting. Dan looked at his watch, a habit from a past life. The watch had stopped. The hands were frozen at 11:17, probably the time of his death. He asked a kid passing by what time it was. The kid said it was just past 8, morning. Dan walked over to the pier foreman's desk. The hunters were standing around it. Chen, 4 others. Everyone was staring at the stranger with the stick. Dan said that the slime was under the northern pier pilings, 4 meters deep. He said the creature fed twice a day, in the morning around 8 and in the evening around 6. He said the slime wouldn't go for metal. Its jaw hurt from their hooks. The harpoons and hooks had wounded it, and now it wouldn't take anything made of metal. Chen looked at Dan as if he'd just declared himself president of the moon. He asked how Dan knew that. Dan said he could tell by the water. Marcus asked what he meant by tell by the water. Dan said the ripples near the north pier were uneven. The creature was standing on the bottom and disrupting the current. 4 meters deep because the color of the water indicated it. Its jaw hurt because the creature wasn't going far. A wounded creature stays closer to cover, and the cover is the pier. Marcus was silent. His men were silent. The piermaster looked at Dan. Dan said he needed an hour and a piece of silk scarf. The piermaster laughed. He said Dan was definitely crazy. A scarf. Dan said that Pelosa's jaw hurts and he won't take anything rough. He needs soft bait. Something like what he was feeding on before he was wounded. Soft, light, delicate. The piermaster stopped laughing. He looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at Dan, his face inscrutable. Dan said that if he didn't pull Polaz out in an hour, he'd go behind the breakwater as agreed. The piermaster was silent for a long time. Then he called out to someone. A girl of about 10 ran over. The boss's daughter, slender, with pigtails. She looked up at Dan with one eye half closed. The boss asked her for a handkerchief, the one her mom had given her. The girl pulled a piece of pale pink silk out of her pocket, small, with embroidered flowers. She handed it over. Dan took the handkerchief. He sat down right on the pier planks. He took out a box of flies. He opened it. He picked out a hook, not a big one, size 10, medium. He tore a strip the length of a finger from the handkerchief. He wrapped the silk around the hook. He left the end loose. Then he stood up and walked to the edge of the pier. A seagull feather lay at his feet, gray with a white tip. He picked it up, trimmed the barb on one side with a knife, tied it to the hook over the silk with a thin thread from his box. A fly was made. Strange. Soft pink silk and a gray feather. It didn't look like any standard fly. It looked like something small and soft floating on the surface, posing no threat. Dan tied the fly to the leader. He checked the knot. Good. He walked to the edge of the pier above the northern pier pile. People were following him. Fishermen, workers, the pier foreman, his daughter, someone from the barracks. About 20 people stood on the pier and watched as a stranger with a fishing rod prepared to catch a creature that 3 teams with harpoons had been unable to catch. Dan paid no attention to them. He looked at the water. The ripples by the pile shifted slightly. The creature stirred on the bottom. Perhaps it sensed the vibration from the footsteps on the pier. Dan waited. He stood motionless for 3 minutes. The ripples settled. The creature lay still again. He cast. A short cast, 15 feet. The fly landed on the water a meter from the pilings. Pink silk and a gray feather. It lay on the surface of the dark blue water like a small flower. Dan let it drift with the current. The fly drifted slowly toward the pilings. Someone in the crowd behind him started talking. Dan said quietly for them to be quiet. His voice was steady. The man fell silent. The fly touched the shadow cast by the pilings. Dan lifted the tip of the rod slightly. The fly twitched on the surface, as if alive, like a tiny creature trying to swim away. 5 seconds. 10. The water beneath the fly darkened. Something was rising from the bottom, slowly. Dan could tell by the way the ripples changed. The rings spread out from the center. Something large was pushing the water up from below. The fly twitched on its own. A bite. Soft, neat. The grayling took the fly like a trout takes a mayfly, gently, with its lips. Dan set the hook. The rod bent into an arc, and then it got heavy. 12 feet of muscle and mercury-colored scales surged downward. The line sang. The reel screeched. Dan braced his feet against the pier planks and held. He didn't pull. He held. Let it run. Let it tire. That's how a rod works, not with strength, with patience. The snakehead veered left. The line sliced through the water. Dan guided the rod after it. He let it run 30 feet. Then he started reeling it in, slowly, an inch at a time. The pike surged again. Dan let it go, waited, started reeling it in again. This went on for 20 minutes. The crowd on the pier was silent. Chen stood with a stony face. The pier master forgot to close his mouth. His daughter clung to the railing and watched intently. After 20 minutes, the eel grew tired. Dan could feel it. The jerks grew shorter, the pull weaker. The creature was giving in. He brought it to the surface. First, its back appeared. The scales really were like mercury, silver, fluid, alive. Then the head, flat, wide, with long whiskers like a catfish, yellow eyes, 4 of them. Its mouth was slightly open. A silk and feather fly sat neatly in the corner of its mouth. The loach lay on the surface of the water, 12 feet. It wasn't struggling, it was alive, just tired. Dan looked at it. The creature looked at Dan. 4 yellow eyes, calm. Dan saw old wounds in the corner of its mouth, torn, inflamed, traces of harpoons and hooks. The jaw really hurt. He carefully removed the fly. In one motion, a clean grip, no damage. Then he turned to the pier foreman. The man stood there, pale. Dan said that this creature's core would grant pure ability. Because Polaz is alive and hasn't been traumatized by shock, he said he knew who to give this core to. The pier foreman's daughter is deaf in her right ear. The pier boss turned even paler. He asked how Dan knew. Dan said he'd seen how the girl turns her left ear toward everyone who speaks to her, and how she squints her right eye. When one ear doesn't work, the body compensates. He'd been watching people for 20 years and knew what they needed. The pier manager looked at his daughter. The girl was standing by the railing, not understanding what was happening. The core was extracted 2 hours later, a small crystal the size of a grape, silvery with blue veins, warm. The girl swallowed it with water. 10 minutes later, she was sitting on her father's lap, crying, because for the first time in 5 years, she could hear his voice with both ears. The pier manager hugged his daughter and cried too, silently. His hands were shaking. Dan stood to the side, reeling in the line. Chen walked over to him. He stood next to him. He was silent. Then he said it didn't prove anything. Just one fish, with a rod, a trick. Dan said he wasn't arguing. Marcus said something bigger than a flounder would come tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow too, and a rod wouldn't help then. For the first week, Dan caught nothing. He mended nets. Every morning, Ree brought him another tangle of torn ropes, and he sat on the steps of the warehouse and tied knots. Fishermen and hunters came at first out of curiosity. Then they started bringing their own gear. Dan's knots held better than the factory ones. He didn't think about it. His hands just knew how to tie them. 20 years on the Madison River had taught him to tie knots before they taught him to catch fish. A good knot is the foundation of everything. On the third day, a fisherman named Tavis came by, an old man with one eye and a cough from the dampness. He brought a rope, a thick one. The rope held his boat at the dock and had started to unravel. Tavis said a new rope cost 3 cans of water. He didn't have 3 cans. Dan looked at the rope. The weave was standard, 3 strands. It was unraveling in one spot. He asked Tavis for an awl and a spool of thin wire. 20 minutes later, the rope was whole again. Dan didn't just weave the strands back together. He wove the wire into the braid as reinforcement. The rope became stronger than a new one. Tavis felt the rope, twirled it, pulled on it. Dan saw his face change. The old man left and returned an hour later with half a smoked fish and a small spool of fishing line. Good line, braided. He said it was for the rope. Dan accepted it. He understood the system. There were no stores in Port Haven. There was barter. Work for work. Thing for thing. A can of clean water for a service. Dan's knots were worth a lot because no one in town tied them like that. And he started working. Every day. From morning till night. Knots. Nets. Ropes. Twine. Fishing lines. Anything that could be tied or repaired. In exchange, he received food, water, materials, tools, little things that added up to a life. Ree watched. She didn't say much. In the morning, she'd set a mug of something hot and bitter in front of him. Not coffee. Something made from dried seaweed. Disgusting but invigorating. In the evening, they sat on the warehouse porch and looked out at the bay. Ree was silent. Dan was silent. Sometimes she would say something, 1 sentence per evening. On the 4th day, she said that her husband had also known how to tie knots. Not as well, but he knew how. Dan asked what had happened to him. Lee said he'd drowned 3 years ago. He went after the bone skate and never came back. They only found a boot, the left one. Dan didn't say anything. They sat there a while longer. Then Lee got up and went to bed. On the 5th day, a girl came to the warehouse. Not the pier manager's daughter, another one. About 16, small, skinny, black hair cut crookedly, as if with a knife. Her clothes were dirty. She was wearing boots 3 sizes too big. She stood by the door and looked at Dan. Her eyes were quick, alert, like a small animal ready to run at any second. She said she needed a job. Dan asked who she was. She said her name was Haena Park. Dan asked where she was from. She said it didn't matter. Dan asked what she could do. She said she could see. Dan didn't understand. Haena stepped closer. She pointed to the bay. See that boat at the 3rd pier? Dan nodded. Haena said there was something shiny lying under the boat, about 2 meters deep. Maybe a hook, maybe a coin. It's been there since this morning. Dan looked at the water by the 3rd pier. He didn't see anything. He moved closer. He looked closely. After a minute, he made it out. Something was indeed shining on the bottom. Small. He wouldn't have noticed it if he hadn't known where to look. But Haena saw it from the warehouse door, from about 30 meters away. Dan looked at the girl. She was standing there, waiting, ready to hear no and leave. He said she needed boots that fit, and breakfast. Haena blinked. She asked if that meant yes. Dan said it meant come on in. Ree fed Haena, silently. She set a plate of porridge and smoked fish in front of her. Haena ate so fast that Dan thought she'd choke. She didn't choke. She finished it. She looked at the empty plate. Ree served a second helping. Haena ate more slowly the second time. After the meal, Dan asked where she was really from. Haena was silent for a long time. Then she said she was from the Aqua-Prime shelter. Dan didn't know what Aqua-Prime was. Ree knew. Ree turned pale. She said that Aqua-Prime was a corporation, a monopoly on water purification. They control half of the dry cities. They have orphanages. Officially, it's a charity. In reality, they test children as core carriers. They feed them cores and see what happens. Some kids can handle it, some can't. The ones who can't are written off. Dan asked what written off meant. Ree said it meant written off. Dan looked at Haena. Haena was sitting there staring at an empty plate. He asked her if she could handle the cores. Haena said 3 times. The first core gave her sight, that very one. Eyes that can see a speck on the seabed from 30 meters away. The second core gave her nothing, just vomiting for 3 days. The third core, Haena fell silent. She said that after the third one, she ran away. Dan didn't ask what the third core did. Haena didn't want to talk. He said she needed a place to sleep. Ree said there was a cot in the storage room. Haena looked at both of them. She didn't say thank you. She just nodded and went into the storage room. Ree looked at Dan. She said he was collecting homeless people. Dan said he was homeless himself. Ree almost smiled. On the 6th day, Dan began teaching Haena how to tie knots. She learned quickly. Her fingers were nimble, slender, accustomed to fine work. But she was in a hurry, always in a hurry. Dan stopped her, told her to slow down. A knot doesn't like haste. Haste makes for a weak knot. A weak knot means a lost fish. A lost fish means a wasted day. Haena was annoyed. She huffed, but she redid them. By the end of the day, her knots were even. Not perfect, but even. Dan said they were good. Haena shoved her hands in her pockets and turned away, but Dan saw the corners of her mouth twitch. On the 7th day, the pier master came. He didn't come alone. His daughter was with him, May, that same girl with the pigtails, who could now hear with both ears. The pier boss sat down across from Dan. He put a piece of paper on the table, an official one, with the city seal. He said that the Port Haven Council had discussed the case with Polaz. The decision was this: Dan would receive a permit to fish in the bay, without restrictions. The only condition: all the cores he extracts must go through the city commission. Dan can't sell the cores on the side, only through the city. Dan read the paper. He looked at the chief. He said he didn't need to sell the cores. The boss didn't get it. Dan said he wasn't selling them. He was giving them away, to a specific person, to whoever needed the core he'd choose for himself. The pier boss was silent. He said, "That's not how it works. Cores are currency. Cores are a resource. The city decides who needs them more." Dan said, "The city makes the wrong decisions. A core only works if it goes to the right person. He can see who needs it. The commission can't." The pier boss said that was audacity. Dan said his daughter was listening, because the core went to her and not to the person the commission would have chosen. The boss fell silent. May stood nearby, holding her father's hand. She heard every word with both ears. The pier manager looked at his daughter, then at Dan, then at the paper. He said he'd give Dan a month without the commission. If Dan proved his method worked within a month, they'd come to an agreement. If not, it would be up to the city to decide. Dan agreed. The manager left. May lingered. She looked at the fishing rod leaning against the wall, then at Dan. She said she wanted to learn how to tie flies. Dan said she was too young. May said she was 10 and that she wasn't too young. Haena snorted from the corner. Ree stood in the doorway, almost smiling again. Dan said, "Okay, but not today." First, he needed to find a workshop, a place where he could tie flies and prepare his gear. Ree said the lower level of the warehouse was free. If they cleared out some of the junk, there'd be room for a table and a rack, and they could run power from the generator. Dan looked at Ree. She shrugged. She said the rent was 3 credits a week, any kind. Dan agreed. They started clearing out the warehouse that very day. Haena hauled boxes. Ree moved the shelving units. Dan sorted through the piles of ropes and gear. Among the junk, they found an old workbench. Heavy, oak, scratched but sturdy. Ree said it was her husband's workbench. He used it to repair his harpoons. She'd wanted to throw it out 2 years ago, but couldn't bring herself to do it. Dan asked if he could use it. Ree said yes. Her voice was steady. Her face was calm. Her hands gripped the edge of the shelf a little tighter than necessary. By evening, the lower floor of the warehouse had turned into a workshop. The workbench was in the center. On it was a box with Dan's flies, hooks, thread, feathers collected over the week. On the wall was a shelf with tools. A lamp hung over the workbench, dim but sufficient. Dan stood in the middle of the workshop and looked around. Haena sat on a box in the corner. The second week began with rain. Dan woke up to the sound of raindrops on the roof. Ree stood by the window and looked at the sky. Her face was tense. Dan asked what was wrong. Ree said, "The rain." Dan said, "Yeah, the rain." Ree turned to him and he saw fear in her eyes. She said that the rain here wasn't just rain. The water falling from the sky was the same water, ethereal. If it got into the barrels of clean water, the clean water would go bad. If it collects in puddles, a creature might crawl out of the puddles. Small, but a creature. Dan stood up and walked to the window. The raindrops looked ordinary, transparent, but when they fell on the tin roof of the neighboring container, they left a bluish trail, barely noticeable. Out on the street, people were pulling up tarps, covering the barrels with lids. Children were running home. The city was preparing for the rain, as if it were a bombing raid. Dan went down to the workshop. Haena was already there. She was sitting at the workbench, looking out the window. She said that at the Aqua-Prime shelter, they'd been told that rain was a punishment, that people deserved it, that water takes back what belongs to it. Dan said that water doesn't punish anyone. Water is just water. Haena looked at him. She asked how he knew. Dan said he'd worked on the river for 20 years. The river can be angry, it can be calm, but it doesn't punish, it just flows. Haena thought about it. Then she said Dan was strange. It rained for 2 days. Dan spent those 2 days tying flies. There weren't many materials. He used whatever he could find. Bird feathers that Haena collected from rooftops, scraps of fabric that Ree dug out of old stashes, thin wire that Tavis brought in exchange for fixing the second rope, threads unraveled from an old sweater. Each fly was a one-of-a-kind piece. Dan didn't tie any two alike. Each one was for a specific purpose. He explained to Haena as he worked. This fly is heavy. It sinks. It sinks to the bottom. For a fish that feeds near the bottom. This one is light. It floats on the surface. For a fish that strikes from above. This one is bright. Red thread and a white feather. It irritates. It provokes. For an aggressive fish. And this one is dull. Gray. Inconspicuous. It doesn't provoke. It pretends. For a cautious creature. Haena listened. Memorized. Tried tying them herself. The first 3 flies were ugly. The threads stuck out. The feather was tied on crookedly. The knots were loose. Dan didn't scold her. He showed her again. And again. By the end of the second day, Haena had tied a fly that looked like a fly. Not a good one, but recognizable. Dan nodded and said it would do for a start. On the third day, the rain stopped. There was still no sun. It never came out here. But the sky grew lighter, pale lilac, almost gray. Dan went out onto the pier. The bay had changed after the rain. The water had grown darker, thicker. The movement on the surface was more active. Small shadows darted near the shore. The creatures had come out to feed after the storm. Dan read the water. Under the pier, a school of small fish, 4-eyed, a dozen or so. They swirled around the pilings, feeding on something. Maybe algae. Maybe whatever that had been washed away by the rain. Further out in the bay, they were bigger. One shadow, about 3 meters long, was moving slowly along the shore. Another was standing in the deep water near a rocky outcrop. Dan went back to the workshop. He knew what he needed to catch. But he couldn't fish at all. He needed a client, a person in need. in pain, with a story. He didn't understand why. He just knew. When he tried tying a fly yesterday, just for the sake of it, without a face before his eyes, without a story in his head, his fingers wouldn't obey. The thread got tangled. The feather broke. 3 attempts, 3 failures. And then he remembered the pier manager's daughter, how she squinted her eye, how she turned her left ear, and his fingers made the fly on their own in 10 minutes. He didn't understand the mechanics, but he accepted the rule. First the person, then the fly, then the fish. On the 4th day of the 2nd week, his first customer came to him, a woman in her 40s. Her name was Grace. She worked in the kitchen of a public cafeteria. Her hands were burned. The nerves in her fingers were damaged. She couldn't feel the heat. She burned herself every day. She worked through the pain because the cafeteria fed 200 people. Without her, there was no one to cook. Grace came because she'd heard about Pola's, about the girl who'd started to hear. She asked if Dan could help her. Dan looked at her hands, red, blistered, old scars beneath new burns. He asked 3 questions. What hurts? Grace said her hands. Who do you love? Grace said the people at the table, all 200 of them. What are you most afraid of? Grace paused. She said that one day she wouldn't feel the pot boiling over and would scald one of the children helping in the kitchen. Dan nodded. Grace left. He sat down at the workbench. The materials lay before him. A hook, yarn, feathers, wire. He closed his eyes. Grace's hands, red, hot. She can't feel temperature. She needs a creature connected to warmth, to sensitivity, to touch. He opened his eyes and began to knit. An 8-gauge hook, medium, red yarn. Slowly, stitch by stitch. Then a feather. Not a goose feather, a small down feather, slightly reddish. He had found it on the warehouse roof 2 days ago. Soft, warm-looking. He tied the downy feather under the red thread. Then a thin copper wire, 2 loops. The wire conducts heat, a symbol, or something more than a symbol. He didn't know. The fly turned out small, reddish-brown with a copper sheen, like a beetle basking on a rock. He called it the warm beetle to himself. On the morning of the 5th day, Dan went out to the bay. Ree gave him a boat, a small one, wooden, old, with a single oar. Haena sat in the bow. Dan didn't want to take her, but Haena said he needed her eyes. Dan thought about it and agreed. They rowed 200 meters from the pier. The bay was quiet. The water was dark after the rain, smooth. Dan scanned the surface. He didn't need just any creature. He needed a creature associated with warmth, one that lives near warm springs, or one that radiates heat itself. He didn't know what such a creature looked like, but he knew what a warm current looked like in cold water. The difference in density, the difference in the ripples. Warm water rises. It creates micro-vortices on the surface. He was looking for those vortices. Haena sat at the bow and stared into the water. Half an hour later, she said that she saw a glow, faint, orange, about 5 meters deep, to the left of their course. Dan turned the boat. He rowed closer, looked at the surface. Yes, the ripples were different here, slightly faster, slightly more chaotic. Warm water was rising from the bottom. Something down there was warming up, or had warmed up. He tied on a fly, a warm beetle, a reddish-brown speck on the hook. Cast, a long one, 35 feet. The fly settled on the water above the orange glow. It sank. It slowly went down. The red thread and copper wire pulled it toward the bottom. Dan waited. The line slackened. The fly descended. A minute, 2, 3. Haena sat motionless. She already knew. When Dan is fishing, be quiet. Don't move. Don't breathe loudly. The bite came in the 4th minute. Quiet. The line tightened slightly. No jerk, no strike, just tension. Something down below had taken the fly and was holding it. Not swallowing, just holding, testing it. Dan didn't set the hook. He waited. His fingers on the line felt every movement. The creature held the fly and thought. a second, 2, 5. Then the line went down. Slowly. The creature decided to take it. Dan set the hook. The rod bent. The pull was moderate, not a monster. Something the size of a large trout. Maybe a meter, maybe a little more. The creature didn't thrash about. It pulled steady, downward, toward the warmth. Dan worked the reel, let it go, reeled it in, let it go, reeled it in. 10 minutes. The creature came to the surface. Dan saw it, flat, round, like a stingray. But its body wasn't gray, it was orange-red. It glowed from the inside, like coals in a stove. Thin tentacles ran along the edges of its body. They glowed too. The creature lay on the surface of the water, and steam rose from it. It was hot. The water around it bubbled. Haena stepped back. Dan took off his fly. The creature didn't resist. It lay there, glowing, and looked at him with 2 eyes the color of molten gold. Dan could see it wasn't in pain. The fly hadn't damaged its mouth. A clean capture. They extracted the core on the pier. A small crystal, orange with red veins. Warm. No, hot. They'd kept it in a wet rag so they wouldn't burn themselves. Grace came an hour later. Dan handed her the core. She swallowed it, closed her eyes, stood motionless for a minute, then opened her eyes. They were wet. She raised her hands, looked at them. She bent her fingers, uncurled them. Then she touched the mug on the table. The mug was hot. Rie had just poured boiling water into it. Grace touched it and pulled her hand away, and laughed. Because she felt it, the heat. She felt the heat. For the first time in 3 years. She grabbed Dan's hands and held them and laughed. Her hands were rough and hot and alive. Haena stood in the corner and watched. Her face looked strange. Not angry, not joyful. Somehow, hungry. That evening, after Grace left, Haena asked why Dan didn't eat the kernels himself. Dan said he couldn't. Haena asked why. Dan said he'd tried. On the first day. A small kernel from that 4-eyed fish he'd let go. He hadn't let it go. He'd lied in the first chapter. He let it go, but before that he saw a tiny drop come out of it. A spark. He picked it up and put it on his tongue. He threw up for 6 hours. A fever of 40. 3 days of delirium. He lay on the rocks by the shore and thought he was going to die a second time. He didn't die, but he understood. The core wasn't for him. He was the one who caught, not the one who carried. Haena listened. Then she asked if that meant Dan would remain ordinary forever, without abilities, without power, just a man with a stick. Dan said yes. Haena was silent for a long time. Then she said it wasn't fair. Dan said fairness wasn't his specialty. His specialty is fish. Haena didn't smile, but she stopped looking hungry. Overnight, a note was slipped into the warehouse, a piece of paper tucked into the door's crack. The handwriting was neat. The text was simple. The man who talks to water is needed by the depths. Come to the southern cliff on the 3rd night of the new moon, alone, without a signature, a blue drop drawn by hand. Dan read the note. He showed it to Ree. Ree read it. Her face turned to stone. She said, "The cult of the depths." Dan asked who they were. Ree said, "Fanatics. They believe water is a god, that humanity must return to the ocean, that the ethereal waters are an invitation. They kill those who refuse to listen, and recruit those who might be useful." Dan folded the note and put it in his pocket. Ree said he needed to tell the city guards. Dan said he'd think about it. Ree said there was no time to think. They weren't joking. Dan said he wasn't joking either. He turned toward the workbench. On it lay a small box of flies. A fishing rod stood nearby. The bamboo was warm, and in the light of the morning lamp, he saw it again. On the handle, a thin line, like a seared symbol, but when he blinked, the line vanished. He ran his finger along the bamboo. Smooth, nothing, but his fingers sensed it. There was something there, beneath the surface, something that appeared and hid. Dan pulled his hand away. He stared at the fishing rod for a long time. Then he picked it up and walked to the pier. He had to fish today. Questions could wait. By the end of the 2nd week, Dan had 3 clients lined up. Old man Tavis with a bad knee, A young woman named Kira whose shoulder wound wouldn't heal after being bitten by a small creature, and a boy of about 12 named Owen who didn't speak, not mute from birth. He fell silent after seeing a creature drag his mother away on the dam 2 years ago. Not a word since. Dan spoke with each of them. 3 questions. What hurts? Who do you love? What are you afraid of? Tavis said his knee hurt. He loved his boat. He was afraid he wouldn't be able to go out into the bay. Kira said her shoulder hurt. She loved her little brother. She was afraid the infection would reach the bone and they'd have to amputate her arm. Owen didn't speak. Dan sat with him on the pier for an hour. The boy looked at the water. Dan looked at the water too. Then Owen took a stick and wrote on the pier's board. I'm afraid that if I start talking, I'll start screaming and won't be able to stop. Dan read it. He nodded. He wiped the writing away with his foot. Every evening he tied flies, one for each customer. For Tavis, a large hook, thread as gray as stone, a scrap of leather strap instead of feathers, a heavy fly. For a bottom-dwelling creature, the kind that lives in the silt, in the weight, in the pressure, a creature that knows what it means to bear the strain on its joints. For Kira, a medium hook, green thread, a piece of a leaf from some plant that Haena found in a crevice in the rock, a fly for a creature that heals, that regenerates. Dan didn't know if such a creature existed in the bay, but the fly had to call to it. For Owen, Dan sat staring at an empty hook for 3 days, a boy who is afraid of his own voice. What kind of fly is needed? What kind of creature? He couldn't figure it out. His fingers wouldn't obey him. The thread got tangled. He would get up from the workbench and walk around the workshop, sit back down, try again. The thread would snap. On the 2nd day, he went out to the pier at night. He stood above the water. He listened. The bay sounded different at night. A splash, a rumble, a low hum from somewhere deep below, and between all the sounds, silence. Little pockets of silence between the waves. Dan listened to the silence. The boy who is silent. He doesn't need a creature that speaks. He needs a creature that is silent, properly silent. One that knows silence is not emptiness, that it's okay to be silent, and that when you're ready to speak, the voice will come on its own. Not a scream, a voice. Dan returned to the workshop. He sat down at the workbench. A small hook, size 14, white thread, a feather, not a bird's. He took a scrap of gauze from Ree's first aid kit, thin, almost transparent. He wound it around the hook, 1 layer. The fly turned out almost invisible, white on white, silent. He called it the silent ghost. On the morning of the 3rd day, Dan went out on the water, alone. He didn't take Haena. He said he needed silence today, complete silence. Haena was offended. Ree told her it was silly to be offended, and Haena was even more offended and went up to the roof. Dan rowed out into the bay, far, further than he'd gone before, past the spot where Polaz had been standing, past the spot where he'd caught the fire ray, out into open water. It was quiet here. The shore was far away. The town on the cliff was small. The water was black-blue, calm. Dan stopped rowing. The boat rocked. He closed his eyes and listened. The splash of water against the side, a light breeze, the rumble of the depths, and the silence between the sounds. He opened his eyes and looked at the surface. Somewhere here. He could feel it. He couldn't see it. He could feel it. The current carried the boat slowly, to the right, to the southeast. Dan let the current carry him. 10 minutes later, the boat entered a zone of absolute calm. No ripples, no waves. The water was like glass, black glass. Dan looked down, deep, very deep. He couldn't see the bottom, only a blue glow far below, and in that glow, a shadow, small, motionless. The creature stood in the depths and was silent. Dan took out his fishing rod, tied on a fly, a silent ghost, white gauze on a small hook. He cast, quietly. The fly landed on the water without a sound, like a feather, and began to sink, slowly, very slowly. The white dot drifted downward, into the blue glow, into the silence. Dan held the rod and waited. 1 minute, 5, 10. The boat didn't move. The air didn't move. Time didn't move. Only the line was slowly sinking. At the 15-minute mark, the line stopped. It didn't tighten. It didn't twitch. It just stopped sinking. Something down there was holding the float, not with its mouth, just holding it, right there. Dan didn't set the hook. He waited. Another 5 minutes. Then the line started coming up, on its own. Something was rising toward him, slowly, smoothly, without a struggle. The creature surfaced 3 meters from the boat. Dan saw it and held his breath. Small, about the size of a cat, white, translucent, resembling a moonfish but with long, thin fins that spread out across the water like wings. Its eyes were large, black, deep. The creature was looking at Dan. The fly was floating next to it, not in its mouth, just next to it. The creature didn't take the fly. It came to it, as if invited. Dan slowly reached out his hand. The creature didn't move. He touched the water next to it. The water was cold, not like in the bay, cold, and absolutely silent. No vibration, no hum, silence. The creature swam closer. It touched his fingers with a fin, a light touch, like a whisper. Dan picked it up. It didn't resist. It lay in his palms, light, warm despite the cold water, white with blue veins inside. Its heart was beating beneath its transparent skin, a small blue heart. Dan placed the creature in the boat on a wet rag. It lay still. It looked at him with black eyes. It was silent. He rowed back. Haena was waiting for him at the pier. She wasn't upset anymore. She saw the creature and froze. She said she'd never seen a white one. Ree looked and said the same thing. No one had ever seen a white creature. They were all dark, gray, silver, black. This one was white. They retrieved the core an hour later. Tiny, the size of a pea, white with a blue spark inside, cold to the touch. Owen came with his grandmother, the old woman who had raised him after his mother's death. She was holding his hand. The boy looked at Dan. Dan crouched down in front of him. He showed the core in his palm, said it was for him, that it wouldn't force him to speak, that it would give him a silence that wasn't scary, and when he was ready, the voice would come on its own. Owen looked at the core, then at Dan. Then he took the pea from his palm and put it in his mouth, swallowed it, closed his eyes, stood there for a minute, 2. His grandmother squeezed his hand. Dan waited. Owen opened his eyes. They were wet. He didn't speak, but he looked at Grandma and sighed, deeply, with his whole chest. The first deep breath in 2 years. Grandma hugged him. Dan stood up. Ree stood nearby. She said quietly that the boy hadn't spoken. Dan said he would speak. Not today. Maybe in a week. Maybe in a month. The core doesn't give a voice. The core takes away the fear of the voice. Time will do the rest. Ree looked at him. She said he was a strange man. Dan said he was a fisherman. Ree said that fishermen don't understand childhood trauma. Dan said that fishermen understand patience. It's almost the same thing. That evening, Haena asked if Dan would fish for Tavis and Kira. Dan said Tavis tomorrow. Kira the day after tomorrow. Haena asked if she could go with him tomorrow. Dan said yes. Haena asked if she could try casting. Dan looked at her. Haena stood up straight, chin up, eyes serious. She wasn't asking, she was stating. Dan said he'd try to give her a practice cast near the shore. Not in the bay, near the shore, in shallow water, on the shallows. Haena nodded. She went into her storage room. Dan stayed at the workbench. He looked at the fly for Tavish, gray, heavy, a leather strap on a hook. He thought about the old man with the bad knee who loved his boat. Then he thought about the note from the cult of the deep, the the third night of the new moon, in 4 days. He wasn't going to go, but they knew where he lived, knew what he caught, knew that the water accepted him. That was bad. He took the note out of his pocket, read it again. The deep needs a man who talks to the water, talks to the water. He doesn't talk to the water, he reads the water. It's different. Or maybe not. He remembered Mother Bay, whom he hadn't caught yet, whom he doesn't even know yet. He remembered how the water reacts to his fishing rod, how the creatures don't attack the boat in which she lies, how the bamboo warms in the darkness, how the symbols appear and vanish. Maybe he really does talk to the water. He just doesn't know what he's saying yet. In the morning, Dan and Haena went out into the shallows at the western edge of the dam. The water was knee-deep, warm, black and blue. A four-eyed minnow swirled near the rocks. Dan handed Haena the fishing rod. She took it with both hands, tightly, too tightly. Dan said, "Easier. A fishing rod isn't a weapon. It shouldn't be afraid that you'll drop it. It should feel like you're on its side." Haena loosened her grip. Dan stood behind her. He demonstrated the motion. Swing back, pause. The line unfurls in the air behind you. Then forward, smoothly. The wrist leads, not the arm, not the shoulder, the wrist. Haena tried it. The line plopped into the water 2 meters in front of her, in a tangle. Dan said it was fine for a first try. Haena said that it was disgusting. Dan said his first cast was worse. Haena didn't believe him. Dan said he was 8 years old and had hit himself in the ear with a fly. Haena looked at him. She asked if it was true. Dan said it was true. The scar is still there. He showed her a small white dot on the lobe of his left ear. Haena snorted. It was almost a laugh. She tried again, and again, and again. 20 casts. By the 10th, the line stopped falling in a tangle. By the 15th, it was landing smoothly, short, about 5 meters, but smooth. By the 20th, Haena cast 8 meters, and the fly landed on the water without a splash. Dan nodded. He said, "Good." Haena didn't shove her hands in her pockets. She stood there holding the rod and staring at the water. Her eyes were different, not hungry, focused. She asked when she could start fishing for real. Dan said, "Not soon. First, 100 hours of casting, then knots, then reading the water, then maybe fishing." Haena said 100 casts was a lot. Dan said 20 years was more. They returned to the pier. Dan picked up the rod. Today was Tavis's turn. The old man was waiting by the workshop, sitting on a crate, his sore knees stretched out in front of him, his face gray with pain. He endured it in silence. Dan picked out a fly for Tavis, a gray stone, heavy, a leather loop on the hook. He went out into the bay in Ree's boat. Haena at the bow, eyes on the water. Dan was looking for a bottom dweller, the kind that lives under pressure, in the depths, in the silt. He read the water for 20 minutes, found a spot where the current slowed near the bottom, where the water was slightly murkier, heavier. Cast. The fly sank to the bottom. A minute of waiting. 2. A bite. Heavy. Slow. As if the bottom itself had pulled the line down. The creature turned out to be similar to a flounder. Flat. Gray. Heavy as cast iron. Eyes on top of its head. 6 of them, all looking up. It weighed 15 kilograms and was half a meter long. Compact. Compact. Life under water pressure had turned its body into a monolith. The roe inside was gray, dull, heavy for its size. Tavis swallowed it that evening. Half an hour later, he stood up from the box without using his hands. He walked along the pier. There. Back. His knee didn't creak. It didn't hurt. The old man stopped. He looked down at his leg, then at Dan. He said he'd been walking with that pain for 20 years. 20 years. Dan said he was glad. Tavis said he'd bring him the best fishing line he could get his hands on. He left, without limping. The next day, Kira. A wound on her shoulder. It won't heal. Dan tied a green fly with a piece of leaf. He went out into the bay, Haena on the bow. He was looking for a creature that regenerates, a creature that heals itself. He found it by an underwater rock, where the water was a little greener, barely alive. The creature looked like a sea cucumber, long, soft, green with yellow spots. When Dan hooked it, it didn't resist. It just contracted, became half as long, then relaxed, then contracted again, as if it were breathing with its whole body. The core was green, soft to the touch. Kira swallowed it. An hour later, she removed the bandage from her shoulder. The wound that had been festering for 2 months had healed before her eyes. New skin. Pink. Clean. Kira touched her shoulder, moved her arm, a full circle. No pain. She cried quietly, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, said thank you. Left. 2 clients in 2 days. The town took notice. A line began to form at the workshop. Not a long one, 3 or 4 people a day. They came and told her what hurt, who they loved, what they feared. Dan listened. He wrote it down in the notebook Ree had given him. He couldn't take everyone. He needed time for each fly, time for each visit. Maybe 1 or 2 creatures a day, no more. He told people to come back in a week, or 2. Some got angry. Dan understood. Pain doesn't wait. But rushing means snapping the line and losing everything. On the 3rd day, Chen came to the workshop, alone, without a crew. He stood in the doorway. Dan was sitting at the workbench, tying a fly. Marcus watched. He was silent. Then he said he wanted to talk. Dan said he was listening. Marcus said Dan had a problem. The town was starting to believe in him, in his method. The rod, the flies, the quiet catch, the clean cores. People were saying that harpoons weren't needed, that the hunters weren't needed, that 1 man with a stick was doing in a day what 5 hunters can't do in a week. And that's dangerous. Dan asked who it was dangerous for. Marcus said, for everyone. Because Dan is alone. If he gets sick, if he breaks his rod, if he gets killed, the town will be left without cores, without protection, without anything. Because by that point, the hunters will have forgotten how to work. Why risk your life with a harpoon if a weirdo with a fishing rod can do it all himself? Dan listened. Marcus was right. Not about everything, but about the main thing. 1 man is fragile. Marcus said he wasn't offering friendship. He was offering a partnership. The hunters would keep working. The harpoons would stay. But Dan teaches those who want to learn, not how to use a fishing rod, how to read the water, how to understand the creatures, where they stand, what they feed on, when they're dangerous. The harpooners need this knowledge just as much as they need a fishing rod. Dan looked at Marcus. 20 years with a harpoon, scars on his hands, pride, anger, and fear. Not for himself, for the city. Chen wasn't afraid of Dan. Chen was afraid of becoming useless. Dan said he agreed, on 1 condition. Marcus asked what it was. Dan said that Marcus would be his first student. Marcus was silent for a long time. Then he said he'd been killing creatures with a harpoon for 20 years. That was his life. His hands remembered the recoil. His shoulder remembered the weight. He didn't know if he could retrain. Dan said he didn't need to retrain. He needed to add to his skills. A harpoon plus knowledge of the water was better than a harpoon alone. Marcus thought about it. Then he nodded. He said tomorrow at 6 in the morning on the pier. He turned around. He left. Haena was sitting in the corner and had listened to the whole conversation. When Marcus left, she said that Dan had bought him off. Dan said he hadn't. Haena said he had. He called him the first apprentice. That means the chief. That means important. For 20 years, Chen had been told he was the city's chief hunter. Dan had just told him the same thing in different words. Dan looked at Haena. For a 16-year-old, she saw people too clearly. He said that Marcus really would be the first apprentice. Haena asked, "What about me?" Dan said she was a 0, because she was already learning. Haena opened her mouth, closed it, turned away toward the wall, but her ears turned red. That evening, Lee and Dan sat on the porch. Sunset. No, there's no sunset here. The sky just gets dark. Lilac turns to black. No stars. Ree said that tomorrow was the third night of the new moon. Dan nodded. Ree asked if he would go. Dan said no. Ray said they would come on their own. If he didn't come to them, they would come to him. That's how it was with Lars, her husband. They called him 3 times. He refused 3 times. The 4th time, his boat was found empty. Dan turned to her. Ray was looking at the water. Her face was stony, her hands on her knees. Calm. She spoke of it as if it were the weather, a fact. Her husband had been killed by the cult of the deep, not a creature, people. Dan asked why she hadn't said anything sooner. Ree said, what difference would it have made? Dan was silent. Ree said that Lars had been a good hunter, not the best, but good, and the cult wanted him. And when they didn't get him, they eliminated him. Because a good hunter who turned down the cult is a threat. He might tell others, might warn them, might resist. It's easier to get rid of him. Dan asked who was in the cult. Ree said no one knows. They're everywhere. Maybe a fisherman, maybe a merchant, maybe a guard on the dam. They wear blue drops, tattoos, small ones, behind the ear or on the wrist, but not everyone shows them. Dan thought about the note. The handwriting was neat. The paper was clean, not torn, not dirty. Clean, smooth paper in a city where paper is scarce. The person who wrote the note had access to resources, not just a fisherman, someone higher up. Dan said he wouldn't go to the meeting, but he'd prepare. Ree asked how. Dan said he didn't know yet. The night passed quietly. No one came. In the morning, Dan went out to the pier at 6. Marcus was already standing there. 2 of his crew were with him, young, on edge. Dan said no spear gun today, just eyes. He led them along the pier, stopped, pointed at the water. He asked what they saw. Marcus said water. Dan said he saw 4 different currents, a surface current from south to north, a mid-level current from west to east, a deep current from the north, and a local one around the pilings, swirling. Marcus looked at the water. He saw the water. Dan said that was normal. 20 years of looking at water as an enemy makes it a habit. Water isn't the enemy. Water is text. You have to read it. Ripples are letters. Currents are words. Color is volume. Dark water screams. Light water whispers. Marcus listened. His face was inscrutable, but he listened. Dan spent 2 hours with them. He showed them how to determine depth by color, how to find a shoal by the ripples, how to see the shadow of a creature by the distortion of the surface. Marcus didn't say a word in 2 hours. Neither did his men. At the end, Dan asked if Marcus had seen anything new. Marcus remained silent. Then he said the ripples at the second pile were uneven. Something was standing on the bottom there, something small. Dan nodded. Marcus had seen it. The first step. Marcus turned and walked away. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say goodbye. He just left. His men followed him. 3 days after the failed meeting, a girl came to the workshop. May, the pier manager's daughter, 10 years old, pigtails, serious eyes. She stood in the doorway and said she wanted to learn how to tie a fly. Dan asked why. May said she wanted to catch something for her mom. Her mom's back hurts. Every night her mom lies on the floor and can't get up. But in the morning, she gets up and goes to work. And she doesn't complain to anyone, but May sees it. Dan looked at the girl. She wasn't asking. She had come with a decision. She was 10 years old and she had a plan. To catch a creature, to get the core, to fix her mom. He told her to sit down. May sat on a stool next to the workbench. Her feet didn't reach the floor. Dan placed a hook in front of her, a small one, size 16, thread, white, a feather, a gray seagull's. He said, watch. He took a second hook, clamped it in a small vise, began winding the thread, slowly, turn by turn, each movement distinct, visible. May watched. She didn't blink. Dan secured the thread. He took the feather, cut off the barb, a thin strip, placed it on the hook over the thread, tied it down with 3 turns, secured it with a knot, showed it to May. A fly, simple, white thread and a gray feather. Looks like a moth. He said, now you. May took the hook, tiny fingers. The thread was thicker than needed for hands like hers, but she took it, started winding. The first loop was crooked. The thread slipped. May caught it. She wound it again. The second loop was better. The third was even. Dan didn't interfere. He stood nearby, watching. Haena sat in the corner on a box. She was watching too. Ree stood in the doorway. She was watching too. May wound the thread. Feather, thread, knot. Feather, thread, knot. Her fingers were small and clumsy. The thread got tangled. The feather broke. May didn't stop. If the feather broke, she took another one. If the thread got tangled, she untangled it and started over. 20 minutes, 30, 40. Hands at the workbench. Feather, thread, knot. Dan watched her hands and thought of the Madison River, of how his father had given him a fishing rod for the first time. He was 6. His father said, "Take your time. The fish will wait. First learn to hold it, then to cast, then to wait. The fish will come later. You first." May looked up, a hook in her hands, a fly on the hook, crooked. The thread sticks out in 2 places. The feather is tied on crookedly. The knot is loose. The fly looked like a fly, just as a child's drawing looks like a house. Recognizable, but not exactly. May showed it to Dan. He took the fly between 2 fingers, held it up to the light, turned it over, examined it seriously, just as he would examine a fly tied by a master with 30 years of experience, without a smile, without condescension. He said the fly was good, it would get a bite. May asked if it was true. Dan said it was true. Haena snorted from the corner. Ree nudged Haena with her elbow. Haena fell silent. May took the fly, pressed it to her chest, said she'd come back tomorrow. Ran off. Dan watched her go. Haena said the fly was awful. Dan said he knew. Haena said nothing would bite on it. Dan said, "We'll see." Ree didn't say anything. She looked at Dan, and there was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, not respect, something quieter, deeper. She turned away and went upstairs. Every day the following week, May came by after lunch. She sat down at the workbench. She knitted. Dan taught. He showed her. He corrected her. But he didn't do it for her. Never. The flies got better, slowly. By the 5th fly, the knots were neater. By the 8th, the feather lay correctly. By the 10th, May had tied a fly that Dan examined longer than usual. Simple. White thread. Gray feather. But clean. Neat. The knots were tight. The feather lay just right. He said this one was ready. May asked if it was for Mom. Dan said it was for Mom, but not yet. The fly needs a bigger hook and more interesting material. A seagull feather won't work for what Mom needs. May asked what would work. Dan said he didn't know yet, that he needed to think about it. May nodded, patiently. She'd learned that from him. In the middle of the 3rd week, what Dan had been waiting for and fearing happened. The cult of the depths made itself known. Not with a note. Tavish's boat. The old man went out fishing in the morning, out of habit. Now, with a healthy knee, he could go out every day. An hour later, the boat returned empty. The sail was up. The rudder was locked, heading for the pier. The boat came in on its own. Tavis wasn't on it. A wet piece of paper lay on the bench, a blue drop, drawn by hand, and one word, next. Dan stood on the pier, holding the wet piece of paper. Ree stood next to him, white. Haena stood slightly behind them. Her eyes were angry. Marcus arrived 10 minutes later. He looked at the paper. His face darkened. He said that Tavis was dead. Dan said he might not be dead. Maybe they took him. Marcus said the cult doesn't take people. The cult gets rid of them. Dan crumpled the piece of paper. Tavis, an old man with a bad knee that didn't hurt anymore, who loved his boat, who brought the best fishing line he could get. Dead. Because Dan cured him. Because the cult saw it as a threat. Or a message. Haena said they had to find them. Marcus said you don't find them. They find you. Ree said we need to talk to the city guards. Dan said no. The city guards won't help. The cult is inside the city. Someone on the guard might be in the cult. The note was brought to his door. Across the dam. Through the gates. Past the guards. That means the cult has access. Marcus looked at Dan. Said the guy with the stick was starting to think like a soldier. Dan said he thinks like a fisherman. When there's a predator in the river, you don't chase after it. You study its habits, where it stands, when it feeds, what attracts it. Then you make cast. Marcus asked if he was going to catch the cult with a fishing rod. Dan said he was going to figure out who they were, what they wanted, why him specifically, and then it would become clear what to do. Ray said it had been clear to her husband too, and then they found the boat empty. Dan looked at her. She was staring at the water, her face stony. He said he wasn't going out on the water alone. Ray said Lars had said the same thing. Dan didn't know what to say. That evening, he sat in the workshop, alone. Haena was asleep. Ree had gone upstairs. The workshop was dark. Only the lamp on the workbench. In its light, the fishing rod. Bamboo, warm. And on the handle, symbols. Dan froze. Not just one symbol, 3. Thin lines, like veins on a leaf. They glowed, faintly, blue. The same black-blue color as the ethereal waters. Dan brought the fishing rod closer to the lamp. The symbols didn't disappear. They were there. 3 marks, not letters, not numbers, something else. A language he didn't know. He ran his finger over the first symbol. Warmth. Not hot, warm. Like when you put your hand on a sleeping child's forehead. The second symbol. Cold, brief, like the touch of ice. The third. Nothing. Emptiness. As if his finger had fallen into a hole that wasn't there. Dan withdrew his hand. The symbols glowed for another minute. Then they slowly faded. The bamboo remained warm. Dan sat in the darkness and thought. The rod isn't his. No, the rod is his. He knows every curve, every crack. It's his rod. But there's something on it. Something that wasn't there on the Madison River. Something that appeared afterward, or was always there. And it's coming through here, because the water is different here, and the rod responds to it. He thought about the cult's words. A man who talks to water. Maybe the rod is a translator. Maybe the symbols are words. A month, 30 days in Port Haven. Dan counted the notches on the workshop wall. 1 notch every morning. 30. Over the course of that month, he caught 11 creatures, 11 cores. 11 people got what they needed. Grace feels her hands. Tavi walked without pain, before he was killed. Kira moves her shoulder. Owen. Owen spoke, on the 12th day after the core. Grandma ran to the workshop in the morning. She was crying. She said the boy had woken up and said good morning, quietly, in a whisper, but he said it. Dan nodded. He knew it would happen. 7 other people. A man with chronic headaches received the core of a creature that lived in a quiet, dark canyon at the bottom of the bay. The pain went away. A woman with an injured leg received the core of a fast, bottom-dwelling creature. Her leg healed properly within a day. A boy with asthma. Dan fished for 3 days for him. He looked for a creature that breathes, that truly breathes. He found it on the surface a mile from the shore. A creature resembling a flying fish with gills the size of a palm. It breathed water and air at the same time. The core from it was as light as a feather. The boy took a deep breath for the first time in his life. The city was changing. Dan could feel it. People on the streets were looking at him, not like he was a weirdo, like he was something needed, important, irreplaceable. That scared him more than the cult. Irreplaceable means vulnerable. Marcus came every morning, 6 o'clock, never late. There are 4 of them now, his 2 catchers. A young guy from the shipyard, and Haena. Dan didn't want to let Haena in on the lessons with the catchers. She came on her own, stood next to Marcus, said she'd listen. Marcus looked down at her, asked what kind of little thing she was. Haena looked up at him, and said that a little thing could see the ripples at the second pile from 30 meters away, and he could see them from 3. Marcus looked at Dan. Dan shrugged. Marcus nodded. Haena stayed. The lessons were simple, reading the water. 1 skill each day. Color and depth, ripples and currents, shadow and mass, temperature and density. Marcus learned in silence. He didn't ask questions. He watched. He tried. He made mistakes. He tried again. After 2 weeks, He could determine the depth to within a meter by the color of the water. After 3 weeks, he could see the shadow of a medium-sized creature at a depth of up to 5 meters. It was slow, but it happened. On the 30th day, Sora arrived. Dan didn't know who she was. He saw a woman of about 26, short, thin, black hair cut short, glasses with thin frames on her nose. The left lens was cracked. The crack ran diagonally from corner to corner. It didn't obstruct her vision, but was noticeable. Sora came as a customer. She stood at the workbench. She said she needed a core. Dan asked 3 questions. What hurts? Sora said nothing. Dan looked at her. She stood straight. Her back was straight. Her hands were at her sides, like a soldier. He said that everyone comes because something hurts. Sora said it wasn't her who was in pain. It was her sister. Dan asked what was wrong with her sister. Sora was silent for 7 seconds. Dan counted. Then she said her younger sister had been in a coma for 3 years. Her nervous system was destroyed by an early core. She was 14 when they fed her a core that wasn't right for her, unprocessed, rough, from a creature killed by a harpoon. The core caused a shock. The neural connections burned out. Her sister lies there, breathing. Her heart beats, but she doesn't wake up. 3 years. Dan listened. Haena stood in the corner, pale. She knew what an early core was. 3 cores at the Aqua-Prime shelter. She survived. Sora's sister didn't. Dan asked the second question. Who do you love? Sora said her sister, quickly, without a pause. Third, what are you most afraid of? Sora was silent longer. Then she said she was afraid that one day she would come to her sister and she wouldn't be breathing. Dan nodded. He asked where her sister was. Sora said in the medical block of the Silent Core, a 3-day boat ride away. Dan asked what the Silent Core was. Sora fell silent. Then she said it was a military scientific organization. They study the ethereal waters. They're looking for ways to stop the water's advance onto land, or at least slow it down. Dan asked, and you? Sora said she was an observer, sent to Port Haven 3 weeks ago, to observe the anomaly. Dan asked, what anomaly? Sora looked at him, at the fishing rod behind his back. She said, you. Silence. Haena in the corner tensed up. Her hand went to her belt. She had a knife there, a small one, a pocket knife. Dan saw it. He raised his hand. Haena stopped. Dan asked Sora what monitoring meant. Sora said that the Silent Core had received information about a man who catches creatures with a fishing rod and extracts pure cores. Command sent her to check it out. If true, to assess it. If a threat, then... She didn't finish. Dan finished her sentence. Eliminate. Sora nodded. Dan asked what the conclusion was. Sora was silent. Then she said the conclusion was ambiguous. Dan is not a threat. Dan is an anomaly. Anomalies need to be studied, not eliminated. But that's her opinion. Command might decide otherwise. Dan asked why she was telling him this. Sora said because she needed his help. Sister. Coma. 3 years. Dan is the only one who extracts pure cores. The core of a creature killed by a harpoon destroyed her nervous system. Maybe the core of a living creature will restore it. Dan looked at her. Glasses with a cracked lens. She doesn't replace it. The crack is a reminder. Of what? Of her sister. Of that day. Of her guilt. Every time he looks through the cracked lens, he sees the world is broken. Because the world is broken. Until his sister wakes up. Dan said he needs a creature connected to sleep. With nerves. With healing abilities. He doesn't know if there's one like that in the Bay Area. But he'll try. Sora asked what she should do. Dan said she needed to answer one question. Does she work for him or for the Silent Core? Sora said she works for her sister. Dan said that was enough. Sora left. Haena exhaled. She told Dan to away. She's a spy, a soldier, a sniper most likely. You can tell by the way she stands, the way she holds her hands, the way she scans the room when she enters, and Dan trusts her. Dan said he doesn't trust her, but her sister is 14 and hasn't opened her eyes in 3 years, and if Dan can change that, he'll try. Haena said that wasn't an answer. Dan said there wasn't another one. The next day, Dan went out into the bay, far out, further than ever before, Ree at the oars, Haena at the bow. He was looking for a special creature, the one that lives in dreams. He didn't know what she looked like, didn't know where she hung out, but he knew what he needed. He spent 2 days tying the fly, a complicated one, a small hook, silver thread, made from the wire Haena had unwound from an old generator. The feather was soft, downy, white with gray, and a small piece of fabric from a pillow. Haena asked why the pillow. Dan said that a creature associated with sleep should respond to something that smells like sleep. Haena said that was crazy. Dan agreed. They were in the open bay for 3 hours. Dan was reading the water, looking for a spot where the current slowed to a standstill, where the water stood still, didn't move, slept. Haena saw it first, a patch, far to the right. The water there was a different color, not black-blue, purple. A deep, dark purple, and warmth emanated from it, faint, like from the body of a sleeping person. Dan steered the boat over. Ree rowed in silence. She stared at the purple water and her hands turned white, but she kept rowing. Dan cast his line. The fly landed on the violet water. It sank. It went down. He waited. For a long time. 20 minutes. 30. Haena was getting nervous. Ree sat motionless. Dan waited. At the 40-minute mark, the line twitched. Not a bite. A vibration. Long. Faint. As if someone at the bottom were purring in their sleep. Dan didn't set the hook. He began to reel it in slowly, an inch at a time. The line came up easily. Whatever was on the end offered no resistance. It hadn't woken up. It was following the fly in its sleep. The creature appeared on the surface. Dan saw it and stopped breathing. A jellyfish, but not an ordinary one. The size of a pillow, translucent, purple with silver threads inside. The threads pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, like neurons, like a nervous system turned inside out. The jellyfish lay on the surface, its tentacles spread out, long, thin. They shimmered silver. The creature was asleep. It had no eyes, or maybe it did. Tiny dots along the edge of the dome, dozens of them, all closed. A sleeping jellyfish. Dan picked it up with his hands. It was warm, soft, like a blanket. The tentacles wrapped around his wrists, not stinging, not squeezing, simply, like a child's hand in a dream grasping a parent's finger. Ree watched. Haena watched. No one spoke. Dan placed the jellyfish in the boat. It lay there, pulsing silver, asleep. Its core was different, not a crystal, a drop, a silvery liquid drop the size of a fingernail. It shimmered, as if tiny flashes of lightning were beating inside it. Dan held the drop in his palm and thought of the 14-year-old girl who hadn't opened her eyes in 3 years. He gave the drop to Sora that evening. She was standing by the workshop, waiting. She saw the drop and her face. Dan had seen many faces this past month, the faces of people who get what they need. But Sora's face was different. She didn't cry, she didn't laugh. She just stood there and looked at the silver drop in his palm, and her hands were trembling, slightly, as if something inside her had let go, a spring that had been coiled for 3 years. Dan said the drop should be given to her sister, placed on her lips, the creature that sleeps. Its core doesn't wake her. It repairs what is broken in her sleep. Nerve connections, neurons, the pathways along which signals travel from the brain to the body. Sora asked how he knew. Dan said he could feel it. The creature was asleep, and in her sleep, everything was working. The threads pulsed, signals traveled. In her sleep, she was whole. The core carries that, the wholeness of sleep. Sora took the drop. Her hands were shaking. She placed the drop in a small container. She closed it. Then she looked at Dan. She stood before him, a quiet core sniper, sent to observe and, if necessary, eliminate. Glasses with a cracked lens. She said she would leave tomorrow. She would take the core to her sister. She'll come back. Dan asked why she'd come back. Sora said because this is where she belongs, not as an observer, as a person. Dan nodded. Sora turned and walked away. She stopped halfway. Without turning around, she said that if anyone tried to harm him, she'd find out, and she wouldn't need a fishing rod to solve the problem. She left. Haena was standing on the porch. She said, "Well, there you go. Another crazy one." Ree stood nearby. She said that at least this one had a weapon. Dan watched Sora walk away. He thought about the silver drop, about the sleeping girl, about the crack in the lens of his glasses, about the spring that had snapped. Then he turned and went into the workshop. Tomorrow he had to fish, for someone else. Sora was gone. A week passed. 2. The city went on with its life. Dan fished. 1 trip out every day, sometimes 2. The flies ran out faster than he could tie them. There weren't enough materials. Haena scurried around the city, collecting feathers, thread, scraps of fabric, wire, anything that could be used for a fly. She became a good hunter, quick, nimble, eyes that could spot shiny wire and a pile of trash from 20 meters away. May came every day, tied flies, got better. Marcus came every morning, learned. His hunters learned. Now there were 6 of them in class. Marcus, his 2 veterans, a young guy from the shipyard named Nico, Haena, and a quiet man in his 30s named June, who used to repair boats and now wanted to steer them. Dan taught them to read the water, slowly, patiently, just as he'd taught Haena to cast, just as he'd taught May to tie flies. Show it 100 times, wait 1,000 times. The town was noticing the changes. Marcus's hunters were starting to come back with a catch, not because they fought the creatures better, because they knew where the creature was. They didn't waste hours searching. They went straight to it. They struck true. Casualties went down. Not a single casualty in 2 weeks. Before, every time they went out, someone would come back with a hook in their shoulder or a bite on their arm. Marcus didn't say thank you. Marcus said, tomorrow at 6. That was better than thank you. In the middle of the 5th week, Ember arrived. Dan heard her before he saw her. Her voice, loud, fast, a stream of words that wouldn't stop. She was talking to the guard on the dam, asking for directions, then asking what kind of town this was, then asking why the walls were so rusty, then asking if the generator by the gate could be fixed because she could hear it knocking on the 3rd cylinder, which meant the piston, and if it wasn't replaced, it would break down in a week. The guard said nothing. Ember kept talking. She walked into the workshop like the wind blows through an open window. Red hair, freckles, green eyes, hands covered in oil, overalls patched in 12 places. She looked at the workbench, at the fly, at the fishing rod, at Dan. She said her name was Amber Wallace, from Dry Enclave 4, a mechanic. She'd walked here 4 days, because she'd heard there was a man in Port Haven who caught creatures with a stick, and she wants to see that stick, because the stick is made of bamboo, and bamboo doesn't grow in this world. All the bamboo rotted when the ethereal waters came. Bamboo can't tolerate ethereal moisture. So this stick is either pre-war, which is unlikely because pre-war bamboo rotted long ago, or it isn't quite bamboo, and Amber wants to know what it is. Dan listened. Haena listened from the corner with her mouth agape. Ree stood in the doorway and looked as if someone had let a talking hurricane into the house. Dan handed the rod to Amber. She took it, carefully. Despite all her boisterousness, she took the rod as gently as one would hold a newborn. She turned it over, looked at the handle, at the guides, at the tip. She tapped the shaft with her fingernail, listened, bent it slightly, let go, watched it straighten, then said it wasn't bamboo. Dan said it was bamboo. Amber said no. It looks like bamboo, it sounds like bamboo, it bends like bamboo, but the structure is different. The fibers run not lengthwise but in a spiral. She's seen thousands of materials. She'd taken apart engines, repaired generators, sorted through mechanisms from pre-war factories. She knows the structure of wood, metal, plastic, composites. This fishing rod is made of something that looks like bamboo but isn't. Dan took the rod back. He looked at it. For 20 years he'd thought it was bamboo, the fishing rod his father had given him. Bamboo, 7 feet long. Classic. He knew every knot on it, every crack. But Amber said the fibers ran in a spiral, and with bamboo, the fibers run lengthwise. It's true. He knew that. He just hadn't checked. 20 years. Amber said she wanted to stay. Dan asked why. Amber said she wanted to understand what the rod, a fishing rod, and she wants to learn to do what Dan does, not catch fish, to build. If a fishing rod is a tool, then you need spare parts. You need a reel better than this rusty one. You need guides made of decent metal. You need a case. You need a workshop with proper lighting, not this dead bulb. Dan said he didn't have the money to pay her. Amber said she doesn't need money. She needs a workbench and permission to tinker. Ree said there were 2 workbenches in town, this one and the one in Marcus's smithy. Amber said a corner would be enough for her, any corner, and access to the generator. She could hear the warehouse generator knocking too, the 3rd cylinder, a bearing. Ree looked at Amber, then at Dan. Then she said the generator had been knocking for half an hour, and no one could figure out why. Amber said she'd fix it in an hour. Ree said there was a corner in the basement. Amber fixed the generator in 40 minutes. Ree set a plate of food in front of her. Amber ate and talked at the same time. She told her that in Dry Enclave 4, she fixed everything: generators, pumps, filters, winches, outboard motors. Her father was an engineer. He taught her everything. No, he didn't teach her. She taught herself. Because her father said girls don't build things. She built things out of spite. Every repaired engine was a response to her father. Every working generator was proof. Then her father died, and there was no one left to prove anything to. So she left. Because without her anger toward her father, she had no reason to stay. Dan listened. Haena listened. Ree listened. Amber spoke. Then she fell silent. She looked at her plate. It was empty. She looked at Dan. She asked what? Dan said nothing. Welcome. Amber nodded. She stood up. She went to the basement. A minute later, the sound of tools came from down there. She was already taking something apart. Haena said there were 4 of them now. Ree, Haena, Dan, Amber. Dan said 5. Haena asked who the 5th was. Dan said Sora, when she comes back. Haena said if she comes back. Dan said she would come back. The next day, Dan asked Amber to make him a new reel. The old one worked, but creaked. The mechanism was worn out. The spring had weakened. The line sometimes slipped off. It was fine for small fish, not for serious game. Amber looked at the old reel. She took it apart in 3 minutes. 17 parts on the workbench. She looked at each one. Then she said she'd build a new one, a better one. She needed a bearing from a generator, a steel plate, a spring from a winch, and a day. 1 day. A day later, the reel was ready. Dan took it, spun it. Smooth, quiet. The line lays flat. The mechanism runs without play. The drag is tight. You can reel in a fish twice the previous limit. Dan looked at Amber, said it wouldn't work without her. Amber was standing there. Her hands were covered in oil, red hair, freckles. She blinked, then she blinked again. Then she turned away quickly and said she needed to fix something else in the basement. She left. Haena looked at Dan. She said Amber had blushed. Dan said he hadn't noticed. Haena said he was blind. Dan said he was a fisherman, not blind. Haena said, yeah, a fisherman, got it. That evening, Ree and Dan were sitting on the porch. It was getting dark. Ree said the team was growing. Dan said yes. Ree said it was good and scary at the same time. The more people around him, the more targets for those who want to harm him. Dan said he knew. Ree said Tavis was alone, and they took him out easily. What if they take out Haena tomorrow? Or May? Or Amber? Dan turned to her. Ree was looking at the water, calm, weather-beaten, hands on her knees. She wasn't speaking to scare him. She was speaking because she knew. Her husband had been taken out the same way, and she'd lived alone for 3 years, and now there were people around her again, and she's afraid again. Dan said he wouldn't let anyone touch them. Ree said Lars used to say the same thing. Dan said he wasn't Lars. Ree looked at him for a long time. Then she said she knew and went to bed. The second month, Dan was sitting in the bar, the only bar in Port Haven. It's called Warm Salt, a cramped room on the second floor of a former warehouse. Tables made of planks, wobbly chairs, yellow lamps. It smells of fish and moonshine. Lots of people, hunters, fishermen, shipyard workers. Dan came because Marcus called him. Said they had to have a drink after practice. It's a tradition. Dan didn't drink, but he came. He sat in the corner with a mug of hot water. He watched the people. Marcus was sitting 2 tables away, with his crew, loud, drunk. Marcus isn't drunk. Marcus doesn't get drunk. 20 years with a harpoon have toughened more than just his hands. A woman was standing on a small stage in the corner. Dan looked at her. Tall, slender, black hair down to her shoulders, a dark blue dress. Simple, but it fit her as if it had been made for her. Maybe it had been. She stood in front of the microphone and sang. Or rather, she tried to. Her voice was hoarse, low, broken. Every note came with effort. Dan saw the muscles in her neck tense, how she closed her eyes on the high notes, not from emotion, from pain. She was singing, and it hurt her to sing. The audience wasn't listening. A buzz of conversation, the clinking of mugs, laughter. She was singing for the background, for the atmosphere. No one was looking at the stage. Dan was watching. The song ended. The woman stepped back from the microphone. Her hand touched her throat, mechanically, a habitual movement. She'd done it 1,000 times, checking her throat after every song, as if she were waiting for it to give out completely. She walked off the stage, passed between the tables. Someone slapped her on the shoulder. Someone shouted, "One more!" She smiled, politely, out of habit. She walked over to the bar, poured herself some water, drank in small sips, her throat. Dan stood up, walked over to the bar, stood next to her, said her vocal cords were damaged. The woman looked at him. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, tired. She said that wasn't news. Dan said he could tell by the way she swallowed. The left side of her throat was working, the right wasn't. The right vocal cord doesn't close completely. That's why her voice is hoarse. That's why high notes are painful. The woman set down her glass, looked at him more closely, asked who he was. Dan said he was a fisherman. She said fishermen don't know anything about vocal cords. Dan said fishermen know what's broken. The woman almost smiled. Almost. She said her name was Chang Mi So, that she was the owner of this tavern, that before the war she sang in Seoul, concert halls, full houses, thousands of people, and then the evacuation, water. She swallowed ether water during the crossing. It burned her throat from the inside. Her vocal cords were damaged. Her voice was gone. All that remained was a rasp. She sings every evening because she can't help but sing. It's the only thing she knows how to do. And every evening, it's torture. Dan listened. Chang Mi spoke calmly, without self-pity. Facts, vocal cords, hoarseness, torture, facts. He said he could help. Chang Mi said she'd been told that 4 times. 2 doctors, 1 shaman, and 1 drunk hunter with a core from some incomprehensible creature. The core didn't work. Vomiting, fever, 2 days in a delirium. Her voice got even worse. Dan said that his cores were different, pure, tailored to a person. Chang Mi looked at him for a long time. Then she said she'd heard about him, about the man with the stick, about the pure cores, about the girl who started to hear, about the old man with the knee who was later killed, about the boy who started to speak. She'd heard. She didn't believe it, because believing hurts. Dan said he didn't need her belief. He needed answers to 3 questions. Chang Mi sighed. She said, "Okay. What hurts?" Her throat. "Who do you love?" She fell silent. Then she said, "Music, not people." Music. She had forgotten how to love people when she lost her voice. Because her voice was how she loved, through song. Without song, she doesn't know how. What are you most afraid of? Chang Mi was silent for a long time, her fingers on the glass of water. Then she said she was afraid of silence, complete silence. Someday, her voice would fail completely, and then silence, forever. Dan nodded. He stood up. He said he'd be back. Chang Mi said she knew. Everyone says that. Dan walked out of the bar. Night. A black sky without stars. He walked toward the warehouse and thought. The voice, the vocal cords, the song. He needed a creature that sang, that made a sound, that lived by sound. He remembered the first day, the shore, the fog, shadows in the fog, and a horn, a low horn, like a tugboat, like a siren. Something alive was honking in the fog. He hadn't paid any attention to it then. Now he remembered. Something in this bay is singing. Dan spent 2 days tying a fly, the most difficult of all the previous ones, a size 12 hook. He twisted the line from 3 different threads, white, black, silver. He twisted them so they intertwined in a spiral, like vocal cords. Instead of a feather, he used a thin copper plate. Amber had cut it out of an old tube for him, thin as foil. When the wind touched the plate, it hummed, quietly, low, barely audible, but it hummed, a fly that sings. Dan tied it on and went out onto the bay, alone. Ree didn't want to let him go. Dan said that the singing creature wouldn't come if there was more than one voice in the boat. Too much noise. Silence was needed. One boat, one person, one fly. Ree said he'd promised not to go out alone. Dan said he'd promised not to go out alone at night. It's morning now. Ree looked at him, said he was worse than Lars. At least Lars lied convincingly. Dan smirked, for the first time in front of Ree. She blinked, then turned away. He paddled out into the bay, far out. Past all the familiar landmarks, into open water, where the city on the cliff became a small speck on the horizon. And he stopped. He listened. The wind, the water, the lapping, and somewhere far away, a low hum, like a whale's song, like the vibration of an organ pipe. The creature was singing. Dan headed toward the sound. He rowed for 20 minutes. The sound grew louder, closer. The water around the boat began to vibrate. Small ripples spread in circles. The source was below, deep. Dan cast, a long cast. The fly with the copper plate sank. The line unwound. 10 meters, 20, 30, deep. The fly was sinking, and the copper plate sang as it went. A quiet sound, high-pitched, like a response to the low rumble from below. At 40 meters, the line tightened. Not a jerk. Pressure. Steady. Strong. Something huge down below had taken the fly and was holding it, and singing. The sound changed. A second voice joined the low rumble. Higher. Thinner. The fly sang down below, and the creature sang in response. A duet. Dan didn't set the hook. He listened. The water around the boat trembled with the sound. The sides vibrated. His hands vibrated. The whole world vibrated. Then the creature began to rise, slowly. The line went up. Dan reeled it in, meter by meter, 20 minutes of reeling. The creature broke the surface 10 meters from the boat. An eel, long, 7 meters, slender, silvery. Stripes ran along its body, white and black, like piano keys. Small head, round mouth. A sound came from its mouth, continuous, low, vibrating. The singing eel. The creature was singing, not roaring, not screaming, singing. A melody. Simple. 3 notes. Up, down, up. Again and again and again. Dan listened. The eel lay on the surface and sang, and its silvery body shimmered in time with the notes. Dan rowed the boat closer, reached out, touched the scales, warm, vibrating. Under his fingers, the creature was like a living string. He removed the fly. The eel didn't swim away. It stayed near the boat and sang. 3 notes. Up, down, up. Dan brought it to the pier. The body was long, slender, silvery, like a small flute. It hummed when Dan held it in his hand, quietly. 3 notes. That evening, Dan came to Warm Salt. The place was packed, noisy. Chan-Mi was standing behind the counter. She saw him. She saw something in his hand. He walked over. He placed the core on the counter. The silvery rod hummed softly. Chan-Mi looked at it, then at Dan, then at the core again. She reached out her hand, touched it. 3 notes entered her fingers. She felt them. Dan saw. Changmi took the core, placed it on her tongue, swallowed it, closed her eyes. She stood behind the bar in her bar full of drunk hunters, and she was silent. A minute, 2. Then she opened her mouth and began to sing. Without a microphone, without a stage, just standing behind the bar. Her voice was clear, high, strong, without a hint of hoarseness, no strain, no pain. A voice that filled the room and went beyond the walls. A voice that washed over the bar like a wave. The room fell silent, spoons froze, mugs stopped halfway to the lips. Everyone was looking at Changmi. She was singing, something in Korean. Dan didn't understand the words, but he understood everything, every note, every breath, every pause. She sang, and tears streamed down her face, and she didn't notice. She sang, and the room listened. Chen sat at the table, his mug untouched. Haena stood in the doorway, holding onto the doorframe. Ree stood next to her, not moving. Amber peeked out from the basement of the warehouse across the street and froze with a wrench in her hand. All of Port Haven heard. The song ended. Silence. 3 seconds. Then someone clapped. Then everyone. The clatter of, in a small, cramped bar. Changmi stood behind the bar, hands on the counter, wet face, eyes closed. She was smiling. The first real smile in 7 years. Dan stood in the corner. Changmi opened her eyes. She looked across the room. Her gaze found him. She looked. He looked. They said nothing. There was nothing to say. He went out onto the street. Night. A black sky. The air smelled of the sea, not the usual sea. Ethereal, wet metal, salt, something alive. He walked toward the warehouse, a fishing rod on his shoulder. The bamboo was warm, and on the handle, 4 symbols. There had been 3, now there were 4. A new one had appeared while he was in the bar, thin, glowing, like a note, like a sound frozen in wood. Dan walked and counted, 11 cores in the first month, 4 at the start of the second. 15 people who got what they needed, 15 stories, 15 faces, and 4 symbols on a fishing rod that isn't made of bamboo. It counts something, remembers something. Every core given to another. Every creature released or caught with respect. The water remembers. The fishing rod remembers. Dan approached the warehouse. Sora returned on the 43rd day. Dan stood on the pier and taught Marcus to determine the speed of the underwater by the shape of the ripples when he saw the boat. Small, military, gray. It was coming from the open sea at full speed. A figure stood at the bow. Short, straight, glasses with a cracked lens. The boat pulled up to the pier. Sora jumped onto the planks. She looked at Dan. He saw her face and understood. She said her sister had opened her eyes. On the 3rd day after the drop. Opened her eyes and said she wanted a drink. Her voice was weak. Her hands wouldn't obey her yet. But the neural connections were being restored. The quiet core doctors couldn't explain it. 3 years in a coma, and suddenly the neurons started working. As if someone had turned on the light in a dark house, and electricity was running through the wires. She said this in an even voice. Even and quiet. But Dan saw. Her hands weren't shaking. For the first time since he'd met her, Sora's hands weren't shaking. The spring that had been coiled for 3 years had finally unwound completely. Sora said she'd reported to command. The report was simple. The subject is not a threat. The subject is a resource, recommendation, observation, and assistance. Command agreed. Sora has been transferred to Port Haven on a permanent basis. Officially, an observer. Unofficially. She looked at Dan. She said that unofficially, she was where she wanted to be. Haena stood nearby. She said, "Welcome to the circus. We have a fisherman with a stick, a mechanic who never shuts up, a boatwoman who never smiles, and me." Sora looked at Haena. For the first time, something flickered across Sora's face, something resembling a small, fleeting. She said the circus suited her. The team was complete. Ree, Haena, Amber, Sora, Dan. 5 people. That evening, Dan gathered them in the workshop, all 5 of them at the workbench. He said they needed to talk about the cult of the depths. Tavis is dead. The note was a threat. It's been 3 weeks of silence since Tavis. That's bad. Silence from the cult means they're preparing. Sora said the Silent Corps had intel. The Cult of the Depths wasn't just a sect of fanatics. They had a structure, a leader no one had seen, cells in every major enclave, funding. Money was coming from somewhere, a lot of money. Sora looked at Haena. She said that according to the Corps' data, part of the funding comes from Aqua-Prime. Silence. Haena turned pale. Ree clenched her fists. Ember stopped turning the wrench. Dan asked why a corporation would fund a cult. Sora said that the Cult of the Depths convinces people that Aether Waters are destiny, that fighting is useless, that one must accept it, and those who accept it buy water from the sole supplier, Aqua-Prime. The cult preaches submission. Aqua-Prime sells water to the submissive, a symbiosis, Dan thought. Iona Westmore, head of the Port Haven branch of Aqua-Prime, a man in a clean shirt, the only one who smells of cologne in a city where cologne is a luxury. He waters half the city. It's true, without Aqua-Prime, half of Port Haven would die of thirst. But he's the one funding the people who killed Tavis. Ree said we need proof. Sora said the proof is in the documents stored at Aqua-Prime headquarters here in town. Haena said she knows where headquarters is. She's been there. When she was living on the streets, she used to climb across the rooftops. She saw the guards, 2 at the entrance, 1 on the roof, shifts every 6 hours. Inside, Westmore's office is on the 2nd floor. Dan said they weren't thieves or spies. They wouldn't break into Aqua-Prime headquarters. Haena asked, then what? Dan said he didn't know yet. But when a predator is hiding in a den, you don't climb into the den with it. You lure it out. You set a trap, and you wait. Sora asked what the bait would be. Dan said he would be the bait. Ree stood up. She said no. Dan said the cult wants him. Aqua-Prime wants him. He's the only thing that unites them. If he steps out into the open, both of them will come. And then we'll be able to see who's behind the masks. Ree said it was a suicide mission. Dan said it was a fisherman's plan. Ree walked out. The door didn't slam. Ree didn't slam the door. She closed it quietly. It was worse than a slam. Dan looked at the closed door. Ember said Ree was right. Dan said that Ree was right that it was dangerous. But she was wrong that there was another way. Haena said she would go with him. Sora said she would cover for them. Ember said that if they needed a trap, she could build one. Dan said that a trap isn't mechanical. A trap is a fly. The next day, Dan announced a public catch. Open, on the pier, for the whole town. He told the pier master that he was going to catch a big creature in the bay, in front of everyone, so the town could see. The pier master asked why. Dan said that people needed to see that the water wasn't the enemy, that you could work with it, not to be afraid. The pier manager agreed. The news spread in a day. All of Port Haven knew. A man with a stick was going to fish in front of everyone, on the pier, the day after tomorrow. That evening, Dan went up to see Ree. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the bay. She didn't turn around. Dan sat down next to her. He said he wasn't Lars. Ree said she'd heard that before. Dan said Lars went out alone, in the dark, without a plan, without people. Dan goes out with the whole town watching, in plain sight, with a team. With Marcus and his hunters as backup. With Sora on the roof with her optics. With Haena, who'll spot an intruder before the intruder spots himself. With Ember, who rebuilt the winch on the pier so it can handle a creature twice the size of anything they've caught. Ray was silent. Then she said that Lars had thought he had everything figured out too. Dan said the difference was that Lars went alone, and he didn't. Ray turned to him. Her eyes were dry, her face was stony. She said that if he didn't come back from the water, she'd personally pull him out with a fishing rod. Dan said he was too heavy for his line. Ree almost smiled. Almost. The morning of the catch. The pier was packed. The whole town. Hundreds of people. On the railings, on the roofs of the shipping containers, on the dam, children on their father's shoulders. May was in the front row with her father. In her hands was her last fly, the 14th, the best one. She clutched it like a talisman. Dan stood at the edge of the pier, fishing rod in hand, Amber's new reel, new line from Tavis. The last gift from the dead old man. The fly. He'd tied it all night. A big one. A size 6 hook. The largest in his supply. Thread in 4 colors. White from Ree, black from Haena, red from Ember, silver from Sora. A feather from the warehouse roof. A big one, gray, maybe a hawk's. And a piece of bark, not from a tree, bark from the rod handle. A small fragment had peeled off last night, on its own. Dan picked it up and wove it into the fly. The bark was warm and glowed faintly blue. Dan looked out at the bay. He read the water, for a long time. He stood there watching for 10 minutes. The crowd was silent, waiting. He saw it, far out in the bay, a kilometer, maybe more. The surface of the water was slightly raised, a lens. Something huge on the bottom was creating pressure, and the water above it was slightly higher than the surrounding water, by a centimeter, by 2. No one could see it. Dan could see it. He turned to Ree. He said, "The boat." Ree nodded. The boat was ready, oars in place. Dan sat down. He pushed off from the pier. The crowd watched. He rowed toward a spot in the bay, alone in the boat, a small wooden boat on the dark blue water, Sora on the warehouse roof, a rifle, a scope. She scanned the shore and the water, Haena on the pier, eyes on the surface of the bay, Marcus and 4 hunters in 2 boats on either side, at a distance, not to interfere, but close by. Ember at the winch, hands on the levers. Ree on the pier, hands clenched, face stony. Dan reached the spot. Stopped. The water here was different, thicker, warmer, darker. He sensed something enormous beneath the boat. Not movement, a presence. Like standing on the roof of a skyscraper and feeling the building beneath your feet. He tied on a fly, a 4-color one, made of the rod's bark. He cast. The longest of his life, 50 feet. The line unfurled in the air. The line lay perfectly. The fly touched the water, and the water responded. Not with a bite, with a wave. A circular wave spread out from the spot where the fly touched the surface, wide, slow. It reached the boat and lifted it 1/2 meter. Dan held his ground. The fly was sinking. The line was running out. 10 meters, 20, 30, 40, 50. The line was running out. He tied on a spare, an amber knot, a strong one. 60 meters, 70. The fly was sinking deeper, to where the pressure was, to where something lay on the bottom and wouldn't budge. At 80 meters, the line stopped. It tightened, not a jerk, pressure, steady, monstrous. The rod bent into an arc. The boat listed. Dan braced his feet. The amber reel creaked but held. Something down below had taken the fly and wasn't about to let go. The boat was being pulled down, slowly. The bow was sinking. Water was pouring over the edge. Dan shifted his weight back. The rod in his hands bent so much he was afraid it would snap. But the rod held. Bamboo that wasn't bamboo. Spiral fibers. They sprang back differently. They didn't snap where ordinary bamboo would have. They bent and returned. Dan didn't pull. He held on. He let the rod do the work. He let Amber's reel maintain the tension. And he waited. A minute. 3. 5. The pressure didn't let up. The creature at the bottom wasn't moving. It was just holding on. To the fly, to the line, to the boat, to Dan. Holding on and waiting. Dan understood. This wasn't a hunt. It was a conversation. The creature hadn't taken the fly. The creature had taken the fly, consciously. It wanted to talk. He eased the tension. Just a little. Let the line slacken a meter. The pressure from below eased by exactly that much. The creature wasn't pulling harder. It was mirroring him. He let go. It let go. He pulled. It pulled. Not a struggle. A dialogue. Dan sat in the boat, rod in his hands, wet, water up to his ankles in the boat. People were watching from the pier. From a kilometer away, they could see a small boat bobbing up and down on the water. Marcus in the motorboat came closer. He shouted, "Need help?" Dan shouted, "No, don't come closer." Marcus stopped the motorboat. Dan closed his eyes, hands on the rod. His fingers felt every vibration of the line. The creature below was breathing, slowly. Every breath raised the pressure in the water. Every exhale lowered it. A rhythm. Once every 12 seconds. Dan fell into step. He began to breathe in the same rhythm. Inhale for 12 seconds, exhale for 12 seconds. Slowly, deeply. The line stopped trembling. The pressure evened out. The creature and Dan were breathing in unison. The rod in his hands grew hot. Not warm, hot. The symbols on the handle lit up, all 4 of them. Blue, bright. He opened his eyes, looked at the handle. The 4 symbols were blazing, and between them a 5th was emerging, slowly, line by line, as if someone were drawing with fire on wood. The 5th symbol was different, larger, more complex. Not just a line, a circle. Inside the circle, a spiral. Inside the spiral, a dot. Dan looked at it and felt something shift in his head. Not a thought, not a word, a sensation. As if someone had opened a door to a room that had always been in his house, but he hadn't known about it. The creature below began to rise. The line slackened. Dan started reeling it in, quickly. The reel spun, meter by meter, 50, 40, 30, 20. The water around the boat began to glow, blue, bright, as if a spotlight had been turned on at the bottom. 10 meters, 5. The creature appeared. Dan saw it and stopped breathing. It was enormous. Not 12 feet like the eel. Not 7 meters like the moray. It was the size of a boat. 2 boats. A house. Its body was round, semi-transparent. Like a jellyfish but denser. Inside the body were blue and silver threads. Thousands of them. They pulsed. Like a circulatory system. Like a nervous network. Like a map of rivers seen from above. Fins ran along the edges of the body, wide, thin. They spread out over the water like wings, 20 meters in span. The creature lay on the surface, not all of it, an edge, a part. The rest of the body went down, deep. It was even bigger than what he saw, much bigger. Only the head was on the surface, if it was a head. A round patch of transparent flesh the size of a city courtyard, and on it, eyes. 2, huge, each the size of a window, black with blue irises. They were looking at Dan, calmly. His fly was floating nearby, 4-color, with a fishing rod tip. The creature hadn't swallowed it. It was holding it nearby, like a gift that had been accepted but not unwrapped. Dan looked into the creature's eyes. The creature looked into Dan's eyes. Neither moved. The boat lay on the edge of the gigantic body, like a matchbox on a table. Dan reached out. He touched the surface of the body. Soft, cool. Under his fingers, the silver threads glowed brighter. They rushed to the point of contact, gathered, as if the creature's body recognized his hand. The fishing rod blazed blue. 5 symbols burned, and Dan felt a word. He didn't hear it. He felt it, in his chest, in his hands, in spine. A word in a language he didn't know. But he understood. Not a translation. An understanding deeper than words. The word meant something between hello and finally and we've been waiting. Dan stood in the boat with his hand on the body of a creature the size of a city block and felt the word pass through him. And he answered, not with a word, with a sensation. He thought of the Madison River, of the water, about how 20 years ago he'd stood knee-deep in the current, reading the water and the water reading him, about how the river knew him better than he knew himself, about how he died in the water and the water wouldn't let him go. The creature blinked, both eyes, at the same time, slowly, like a nod. It understood. Then it began to sink, slowly. Its fins curled up, the body went down, water filled the space. The creature was disappearing, but before it vanished, it did something. Fins curled up, the body went down, water filled the space. The creature was leaving, but before disappearing, it did something. A fin, a huge, slender fin swept across the water of the bay. A single movement, wide, slow. And Dan saw the water change. Not the color, not the temperature, something else. The heaviness was gone. The water became lighter, cleaner, not transparent, It remained black and blue, but something in it had changed. Something was gone. Something bad. The creature dove and vanished. The fly floated on the surface. Dan picked it up. Intact. The hook was there. The line was there. The rod's handle was there. The creature hadn't taken anything, and hadn't given the core. It had given a word, a single word in the language of ancient water. Dan rode back. His hands were shaking, not from fatigue, from what he was feeling. The word inside, warm, alive. He didn't fully understand it, but it was inside him, like a seed. The pier, the crowd, silence. Hundreds of people watched the man in the small boat as he approached the dock. Dan tied up the boat. He climbed onto the pier. Ree was standing there first. She looked at him, at his face, and hugged him, silently, tightly, for the first time. Her hands were weather-beaten, warm. Dan stood still. Then he put his hand on her back. She didn't let go. 5 seconds. 10. Then she let go, stepped back. Her face was calm. Her eyes were wet. She said, "Don't do that again." Dan didn't promise. Haena ran up. She asked what that was. What kind of creature? Dan said he didn't know its name. Haena said that all the water in the bay had changed. She could see it. Brighter, lighter, as if whatever was poisoning the water was gone. Marcus walked over. He said his instruments showed a 40% decrease in water toxicity in the bay. In 10 minutes. That's impossible. Dan said it was possible. The creature had cleaned the bay, with a single flick of its fin. Marcus said that changed everything. If the creature, we don't have to kill it, we can ask it. If the water can be purified without Aqua-Prime filters. If. He didn't finish. He understood. Everyone understood. Aqua-Prime sells clean water. If the bay is clean on its own, then Aqua-Prime isn't needed. That night, Aqua-Prime struck. Not at Dan, at the city. At 3 in the morning, the Port Haven pumping station shut down. The station was pumping clean water from an underground reservoir, the only source besides Aqua-Prime's supplies. Ember ran there first. She returned an hour later, her face black with soot. Her hands were burned. She said the main pump had been burned. Not broken, burned. Professional job. An acid mixture poured into the bearing assembly. The pump seized up and the windings burned out. There's no spare. It'll take 2 months to get a new one. Without the Port Haven station, we're entirely dependent on Aqua-Prime, on Iona Westmore, on the man in the clean shirt. In the morning, Westmore came to the pier, in person, with 2 bodyguards, a smile, cologne. He addressed the pier manager, said that Aqua-Prime was ready to increase supplies. At new prices, of course. The city is in a tough spot. Demand has risen, supply remains the same. The economy. The pier manager asked what the prices were. Westmore named them. Double what they used to be. The crowd buzzed. Double. Half of the city won't be able to pay. Children, the elderly, those living on the bare minimum. Westmore said that of course there was an alternative. The man with the fishing rod promised that the water would clean itself. The creature in the bay would fix everything. Maybe it's worth waiting. He smiled. Dan stood in the crowd and listened. He saw what Westmore was doing. A classic move. Put the city in a bind. A reliable supplier with a high price, or a fisherman with promises. Westmore knew the city would choose reliability, because the city wants to drink today, not tomorrow. Dan stepped forward. He stood in front of Westmore. Everyone was watching. He said the water in the bay was already cleaner. 40% cleaner, according to the hunters. Westmore said cleaner didn't mean drinkable. 40% is good, but you can't drink ethereal water. Not even water purified by 40%. It needs to be 100. Dan knew Westmore was right. That was his strength. He spoke the truth, part of the truth, the part that worked in his favor. The water really wasn't drinkable, not even the purified kind. Not yet, anyway. Dan said he needed a week. Westmore asked what for. Dan said that in a week he would make the bay water drinkable. Silence. Westmore looked at him. His smile didn't change. His eyes grew colder. He said, "Fine. A week. If the water isn't drinkable in a week, the city accepts the new prices, and Dan leaves Port Haven. Forever. Dan said he agreed. Westmore nodded. He turned around. He left with his bodyguards. The scent of cologne lingered on the pier for another minute. Ree walked over to Dan. Ticho said he was crazy. Dan said maybe. Haena said a week wasn't enough. Dan said he knew. Ember said that if she had the parts, she could fix the pump. Not in 2 months, in 2 weeks, maybe in 10 days, but not in a week. Sora said that the Silent Corps had spare pumps in a warehouse 3 days' journey. But 3 days there and 3 back is 6, plus loading. Not enough time. Dan listened. Then he said it wasn't about the pump. It was about the water. The bay had cleared by 40% in 10 minutes. The creature had done it in a single motion. If he could talk to her again, if she did it again, or twice, or 3 times, the water would become drinkable. Ree said he didn't know that. Dan said he felt it. A word. The word the creature gave him. It's inside. It can't be translated, but he feels it. And it says that the water wants to be clean. Something is getting in its way. Something people did, or didn't do. If the obstacle is removed, the water will clear itself. Ree asked what the obstacle was. Dan said he didn't know, but he knew who to ask. The fishing rod. At night, Dan sat in the workshop, alone. The fishing rod on the workbench, 5 symbols. He placed both palms on the handle. He closed his eyes. He thought about the water, about the word the creature had given him, about the Madison River, about how water can be clear if left undisturbed. The fishing rod was heating up, slowly. The symbols lit up, one by one. The first, warmth. The second, cold. The third, emptiness. The fourth, sound. The fifth, a circle with a spiral. Dan held the rod and felt it respond, not with words, with images. He saw, not with his eyes, with his inner vision. The bay, but not from above, from below, from the bottom. He saw the bottom of the bay, rocks, silt, sand, and pipes, old, rusty, pre-war. They from the shore out into the depths, dozens of pipes, the old city's sewer system, to tears, to the ethereal waters. The city that stood here before the catastrophe had dumped its waste into the bay. The pipes remained, and something was still seeping through them. Not waste. Worse. Chemicals. Old reagents from pre-war warehouses. They were slowly corroding the seabed and poisoning the water. That's why the water in the bay is dirtier than in the open ocean. That's what's getting in the way. Dan opened his eyes. His hands were hot. The fishing rod was glowing. The symbols were slowly fading. He knew what to do. In the morning, he gathered the team. He told them, pipes on the bottom, chemicals, old warehouses. We need to find them and seal them off. Plug the pipes, remove the source. Then the water will clean itself. Marcus said that diving to the bottom of the bay was a death sentence. It's deep down there. There are creatures down there. There's pressure down there. Dan said there was no need to dive. They had to find the pipes from the shore. They ran from the old city. The entrance was on the shore. Marcus asked where the old city was. Haena said she knew. Near Port Haven. The city was built on ruins. She used to crawl through the basements when she lived on the streets. She saw old concrete corridors, rusty doors, and pipes. She saw the pipes. She didn't know where they led. Now she knows. 3 days. They worked for 3 days. Haena led the way. Marcus and his catchers hauled the equipment. Amber cut the pipes and installed plugs. Sora handled security. Ree coordinated from above. Dan went down into the basements and read. Not water. Walls. Pipes. The direction of the flow. He understood where the liquid was flowing just as he understood where a river flows. The logic is the same. Water flows down. Water takes the path of least resistance. Find the path and you'll find the water. On the second day, they found the main pipe. Thick, 1/2 meter in diameter. A yellow-green liquid, corrosive. It stank so badly that Marcus put a rag over his face. Amber said it was an industrial solvent, pre-war, from a warehouse somewhere up above, leaking, drop by drop, for years, into the bay. On the third day, Amber plugged the last pipe. Welding, concrete, 3 layers, secure. They came up to the surface dirty and exhausted. Evening of the 4th day, Dan stood on the pier. He looked out at the bay. He waited. Haena stood beside him. She asked, "Well?" Dan said, "Wait." They waited. An hour. 2. At sunset, Haena said she could see it. Dan asked what. Haena said the water was getting lighter, slowly, at the edges, near the shore, as if someone were diluting ink with clean water. Dan watched. He saw it. The water was really changing. The black blue was turning blue, just blue, dark, but without the black. By the morning of the 5th day, the water by the pier was dark blue, not black. Marcus took a sample. He tested it. The toxicity had dropped by 80%. Not drinkable yet, but close. On the 6th day, Dan went out into the bay, alone, with a fishing rod, no fly. He stood in the same spot where he'd encountered the creature. He placed the rod on the water, horizontally. The bamboo that wasn't bamboo lay on the surface. The symbols lit up, all 5 of them, and the water around the rod began to form circles, slowly, wide. The circles spread across the bay, as if from a stone, but there was no stone. There was a fishing rod, and a word. Dan stood in the boat and felt the word coming out of him, through his hands, through the rod, into the water. He didn't know what he was saying, but the water knew. The circles went on and on. An hour, 2. The water changed. It darkened in the center. It grew lighter at the edges. Something was coming out of it, black, thick, rising to the surface and evaporating. Mud, poison, pain. Everything people had been dumping into the water for 7 years, and before that. On the evening of the 6th day, the water in the bay was blue, clear blue, dark but clear. Marcus took a sample, tested it, drank it, standing on the pier, drinking water from the bay, just like that, from a mug. Everyone was watching. Marcus drank and his face changed. He said the water was clean, drinkable, slightly sweet, with a metallic aftertaste, but clean, safe to drink. The morning of the 7th day, Westmore's term, the piermaster stood on the pier with a mug of water from the bay. The city doctor was nearby. The doctor checked it, confirmed it. The water is drinkable. Not perfect, but safe. You can drink it. You can cook with it. You can wash with it. You can live. Westmore stood on the pier, without a smile. His shirt was still clean. The cologne still smelled. He looked at the mug of water in the piermaster's hands, and his face was impassive. He said it was a temporary effect, that the water would get polluted again, that nature takes its toll. Dan said that nature had already taken its toll. The water was dirty because people had polluted it. Pipes, chemicals. Aqua-Prime knew about the pipes. Because the pre-war chemical warehouses belonged to the company that became Aqua-Prime, they didn't fix the pipes. They left them. Because dirty water is their business. Silence. Dan wasn't shouting. He spoke evenly, calmly, like a fisherman explaining where the fish are. Facts, pipes, warehouses, the company, Westmore. The crowd turned toward Westmore. He stood straight, calm. He said it was a lie, that Dan had no proof. Leila Morgan stepped out of the crowd, the Port Haven judge, stern, black dress, round glasses. She said there was evidence, markings on the pipes, the company logo, pre-war but legible. She went down to the basements yesterday, alone, saw it, documented it, and she wants the core. Dan looked at her. Leila Morgan, the judge, a woman who had spent 10 years judging people she couldn't trust. She said she wanted to hear lies. More precisely, she wanted to hear when people lied to her so she could do her job right. For the first time in 10 years, Dan nodded. Westmore turned and left, quickly, his bodyguards behind him. The crowd parted. No one stopped him, not yet, But everyone remembered. Dan had been hunting Keith Zvonar for 4 days. It was the longest hunt ever. He knitted the fly for Leila from unusual materials: black thread, thin copper wire, and a shard of glass from Leila's glasses. She suggested it herself, took off her glasses, broke off a corner of the lens, held it out, said that through those glasses she had looked at people for 10 years and couldn't tell which of them was lying. Let the glass finally serve the truth. Dan wove the shard into the fly, a small transparent fragment in black thread and copper wire. The fly looked like an eye, black with a transparent pupil. The bell whale lived deep in the bay, further than any creature Dan had ever caught, beyond the cleared zone, where the water was still dark and heavy. Haena spotted him by the sound, a low, rhythmic thud, like a bell underwater. Boom, 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 every 30 seconds. The bell-ring whale struck the rocky bottom with its tail, and the sound echoed throughout the bay. Dan went out 4 mornings in a row. The first day, he cast the fly. The whale didn't take it. The fly came back untouched. On the second day, he cast it in a different spot, closer to the sound. The whale didn't take it. On the third day, Dan changed the fly. He added a second shard of glass, found it in the basement, a lens from an old device, wove it in. 2 eyes instead of 1. The fly looked both ways, at lies and at truth. Cast it out. Waited 3 hours. At the end of the 3rd hour, a bite, a heavy one. The rod bent, but the creature got away. It snapped the leader. The jerk was so that it threw Dan to the bottom of the boat. He lay there and looked at the lilac sky. The leader was snapped. The fly was lost. The 4th morning, Dan tied a new fly. The same one, 2 glass eyes, but he added something, his own blood. He pricked himself with the hook. A drop of blood on the black thread. It dried. It became a dark spot. Why? He didn't know. He felt he had to. He cast it out. And this time he waited standing up, not sitting, standing in the boat in the middle of the dark water, rod in his hands, eyes closed. He breathed to the rhythm of the whale. Boom. Inhale. Boom. Exhale. 30 seconds between beats. An hour later, a bite. Soft. Cautious. The whale took the fly and held it. Didn't swallow. Dan didn't set the hook. He stood. He breathed. The whale held the fly and thought, or listened, or checked. Blood on the hook. Whose? Why? Could he trust it? 20 minutes later, Kit began to rise. On his own. The line slackened. Dan reeled him in. Kit came to the surface. He wasn't as big as Dan had expected. About 5 meters long. Dark blue. Almost black. Streamlined body. Smooth. No scales. Skin like a dolphin's. A bony growth on its forehead. Round. Like a bell. It struck the water with this growth and made a sound. Boom. Boom. Small eyes. 6 of them. 3 on each side. Everyone was looking at Dan. The creature lay calmly on the water. A fly in the corner of its mouth. 2 glassy eyes. A drop of blood. Dan removed the fly. The core came out on its own. A small black crystal. Solid. Heavy. When Dan took it in his hand, he heard it. Not a sound. A vibration. The crystal vibrated at a frequency you can't hear with your ears but can feel in your bones. The vibration of truth, or the vibration of a lie. The difference between them. Leila received the core that evening, swallowed it, stood there for a minute. Then she opened her eyes. She looked at Dan. He said, "Well, how was it?" Leila said he was lying. Dan asked what she meant. Leila said that he'd asked, "Well, how was it?" but actually knew the answer, because he'd already sensed the core when he held it in his hands. Dan looked at her. She was right. He knew. He felt the vibration in the crystal. He knew the core was working. He was just asking for form's sake. And Leila heard the lie. Not in the words, in the vibration, in the difference between what he said and what he thought. Dan said the core wasn't for catching liars. It was so she could finally hear the truth within herself. Leila took off her glasses, looked at him, then put them back on, said he was telling the truth, and that it was annoying. She turned away. She left. 2 days later, Leila came to the pier. In the evening, Dan was sitting on the steps, reeling in his line. She sat down next to him, silently. They watched the water for half an hour, blue, clear. Then Leila said she'd held 3 hearings that morning. For the first time in 10 years, she knew who was telling the truth. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't assuming. She knew. And she handed down 3 fair rulings. 3, in a single morning. In 10 years, she had never been so certain. Dan listened. Leila said that one of the liars was Westmore's assistant. He had come with a complaint against Dan, an official one: illegal fishing, use of uncertified methods, a threat to the bay's ecosystem. Leila listened to him and heard the lie in every sentence, every single one. She dismissed the complaint. The assistant left, pale. Dan said Westmore wouldn't stop. Leila said she wouldn't stop now either. That night, Dan woke up to a sound. Quiet. A splash. Not in the bay. Closer. By the warehouse wall. He got up, grabbed his fishing rod, went downstairs, went outside. Dark. A black sky. The smell of wet metal. There was a puddle by the warehouse wall. Small. It hadn't rained. The puddle was black, not blue, black. And something was small, many-legged, the size of a cat. A creature from the puddle, placed there, on purpose. Who had brought the ether water and poured it by the warehouse door? And a creature crawled out of the water. Dan stood there with his fishing rod. The creature raised its head. Small red eyes, 6 legs, claws. Not big, but sharp. It hissed. Dan didn't move. The creature looked at him, at the fishing rod, and stopped. Its claws dropped. The hissing stopped. It stood knee-deep in a black puddle and stared at the fishing rod. Dan slowly lowered the tip of the rod toward the water. It touched the puddle. The symbols on the handle flashed. The puddle hissed. The water began to lighten, from black to blue, from blue to clear. The creature stood in the clear water. Its body was changing. The claws clenched. Its legs drew up. The red eyes turned orange, then yellow. It shrank, became the size of a palm. It looked at Dan. It squeaked, quietly, like a kitten. Then it jumped into the puddle and disappeared into the water, deeper than the puddle allowed, as if the puddle were a door. Dan stared at the wet spot on the rocks. The storm came on the 60th day, not an ordinary one. The water in the bay rose a meter overnight. The sky turned black. The wind tore the tarps off the containers. The rain came down in sheets, ethereal rain, blue drops. They fell on the rocks and left glowing trails. Dan woke up to a scream in the street. Someone was shouting that the bay was boiling. He went out onto the pier. The bay was indeed boiling. Bubbles the size of a fist rose from the bottom. The water was foaming, and shadows were rising from the foam. Lots of shadows, dozens. The creatures were coming to the surface, all at once. Small 4-eyed ones, medium-sized ones, large ones. They were heading toward the shore, toward the city. Marcus was already on the pier, with his men. Harpoons, nets, ready. He looked at Dan, said it was an attack. Dan looked at the water. No, not an attack. The creatures weren't heading toward the city. They were running from something. Something in the bay was driving them toward the shore. Something big and evil. Haena shouted from the roof that she could see it. Far out in the bay, a dark spot, moving toward Port Haven, quickly. Sora zoomed in. She said it wasn't a creature. It was a cloud, a black cloud in the water. It was spreading, devouring. Fish that got caught in it floated up dead, belly up. Dan understood. The big storm, a controlled release, poison. Aqua-Prime dumped something into the bay, from the open sea, concentrated poison, to kill all life, to make the water dead again, to make the city depend on them again. Westmore, a clean slate. Cologne, the final move. If you can't buy a fisherman, kill his bay. Dan ran to the workshop. The team followed him. Everyone. Haena, Ember, Sora. Marcus arrived a minute later. He stood in the doorway. Silently, he placed his old harpoon on the workbench. Heavy, scarred by 20 years. He said, "Take it if you need it." "Today I need it." Dan looked at the harpoon, then at Marcus. He said, "Thanks, but no." Marcus asked, "What then?" Dan turned to the crew. He needed the longest fishing rod they could put together. He looked at Amber. Amber nodded. "She gave me 20 minutes, Dan said to Chanmi. "The silver brooch, the one she wears on her dress. We need it for bait. They sent a boy." Chanmi came back in 5 minutes. She unfastened the brooch. Silver, old, the only beautiful thing she had left from her former life. She handed it over without a word. Dan said to Sora, "We need a precise shot, over his head, when he's in the water, as a distraction." "From what?" "He doesn't know yet, but the moment will come." "Sora," rifle on her shoulder, Dan said to Leila, "We need official permission for an unregulated catch." Leila was here. She came when she heard the screams. She said permission was granted and pulled a piece of paper from her pocket. She'd written it the night before, after hearing the storm forecast, because she knew Dan would ask, because she now hears the truth, and the truth was that the storm was coming. Dan said to Ree, "The boat." Ree said, "My boat." "Their boat." Dan said to Haena, "Jacket, for luck." Haena pulled off her jacket, threw it to him, old, tattered, smells of fish and rooftops. Dan threw it over his shoulders, warm. Amber came back, a fishing rod in her hands. Not bamboo, steel, assembled from 3 steel tubes. Light, thin, wire guides. A reinforced reel, the very same one, but with an extra drag. The rod was 10 feet long. Dan took it. Light, flexible. Steel doesn't spring like bamboo, but it springs. He looked at his own rod, the bamboo one, which isn't bamboo. It stood against the wall and glowed. 6 symbols burned blue, all of them, brightly. Dan took both, the steel one in his right hand, his own in his left, and he walked toward the pier. The city watched, through the rain, through the wind. Hundreds of people stood on the pier and on the walls and on the roofs and watched as a man with 2 fishing rods walked toward the boat. Ree was already sitting on the oars. Dan sat down. He placed the steel rod on the bottom. He laid his bamboo one across the gunnels. The symbols glowed through the rain, blue light on black wood. Ree began to row. The boat headed into the bay, into the storm, into the black cloud that was rolling in. Marcus and 4 hunters in 2 motorboats were moving parallel to them. The roof made sides, not close, at a distance. Sora on the roof, finger on the trigger. Haena on the pier, eyes in the water. Amber at the winch. Chanmi stood on the pier and sang, quietly, to herself, to him. Her voice was clear and strong, and it carried through the wind and rain. Leila stood nearby, a piece of paper in her hand. The city seal. Official permission for something that has no name. Dan rowed. Ree rowed. They were heading toward the center of the bay, toward the black cloud. The water around the boat was darkening, from blue to black. Dead fish were floating all around, belly up, 4-eyed, small fry, dead. Dan looked at them and clenched his jaw. He stopped the boat in the center of the black spot. Dead water all around. Nothing alive. Only poison. Dan stood up. He took the steel rod. He tied on the fly. He'd been tying it all night. The most complicated fly of his life. A size 4 hook. Huge. 4 threads on it. White from Ree. Black from Haena. Red from Amber. Silver from Sora. Intertwined in a spiral, like the fibers of the rod. On top of the threads, Chanmi's silver brooch, small, delicate, a silver bird with outstretched wings, tied to the hook with wire. And Leila's seal, a small wax circle with an imprint, pressed into the fly's base, and a scrap of Haena's jacket lining, red synthetic fur, tied to the tail. The fly was ridiculous, huge, made of 6 different materials from 6 different people. It didn't resemble any lure in the world. It was made to a team, to a family. Dan tied it to a steel rod. He cast it out, the longest cast of his life. The steel rod whipped the line out, 60 feet. The fly flew through the rain and wind and landed on the black water in the very thick of the poisonous cloud. And Dan raised his rod, with his left hand, the bamboo one. 6 symbols. He wasn't casting it, he was just holding it, vertically, like an antenna, like a lighthouse. The symbols glowed, and a blue light shot upward, through the rain, through the black sky, and downward, through the water, through the poison, through the dead darkness, all the way to the bottom. Dan stood in the boat in the middle of the black rain, one rod in his right hand, a fly in the water, the other in his left, a lighthouse. The town on the shore watched. Everyone watched. A long pause. Rain, wind, black water, dead fish, nothing. A minute, 2, 3. Dan stood. He waited, just as he had waited 1,000 times on the Madison River. Waiting. Patience. Faith that there is life in the water, even when it cannot be seen. In the 4th minute, the bottom of the bay stirred. The boat was jolted. Ree grabbed the gunwale. The water around them swirled. Huge ones. From the center of the bay to the shores. Waves a meter high. Marcus's boat rocked. And she came, the mother of the bay. Dan saw her outline. Underwater, aglow, blue, huge. She was coming up from below, from the bottom, from the depths, slowly, like the sun rising from beneath the water. The glow grew, spread, filled the bay. The black water around the boat began to lighten, not from the rays, from within. The creature carried light with it. She surfaced, not entirely, an edge, a fin, transparent, the size of a city block. It emerged from the water to the right of the boat and lay on the surface. It stretched for hundreds of meters, thin, shimmering. The bottom is visible beneath it. Strands are visible beneath it. Silver, blue, thousands, millions. A living net, living water. A fly made of 6 materials floated next to the fin. The creature didn't take it. It didn't come for the fly. It came for the beacon, for the rod, for the 6 symbols, for the word Dan carried inside him. Dan didn't reel it in. He spoke. He stood in the boat and spoke softly, not with words. The word inside him vibrated. It came out through his hands, through the fishing rod beacon, into the water. He spoke to the creature underwater, as if to a big frightened fish that needed to be calmed down. No, not frightened, tired. It had been here before humans. It remembered when the water was clean, when the shores were alive, when no one was dumping poison into the bay. It was tired of humans, but it came, because one of them called. Right, with respect, with a fishing rod, not a harpoon. For 20 minutes, Dan stood and spoke, without words, with warmth, through the rod, through the word, through everything he knew about water from 20 years. Ree sat in the boat and didn't move. Tears streamed down her face. She didn't notice. She looked at the light under the water and cried. In the 21st minute, Mother Bay swept her fin through the water. Slowly. One movement. Wide. The fin passed through the black cloud of poison, and the cloud vanished. It didn't dissipate. It didn't dissolve. It vanished, as if it had been erased. The water turned blue, clear, alive. The dead fish on the surface began to sink, to go down, to return to the water. Dan didn't know what that meant. Maybe the water was taking them back. Maybe it was burying them. The creature didn't give a core. Like last time, it didn't give cores. It wasn't meant for that. It gave a word, another one, a second one. Dan felt it, deeper than the first, heavier. It meant something between goodbye and try again and you have little time. And it meant a path, a direction, somewhere, far away. To the east, to the place where the very first tear fell, the first source. The creature knows where it is, and she told Dan, not with words, with direction. He felt it in his body, like a compass in his chest. The mother of the bay had submerged. The light had gone deep. The water had calmed. The bay lay clear and blue. The rain had stopped. The sky remained lilac, but a little lighter, a little warmer, as if even the sky had grown tired of being black. Dan sat down in the boat. His hands were shaking. Both fishing rods lay beside him, the steel one and the bamboo one. There were 7 symbols on the bamboo one. There had been 6. Now there were 7. The 7th was the largest, the most complex. It glowed for another minute after the creature had gone. Then it slowly faded, but the warmth remained. Ree rowed back, silently, her face wet with tears and rain, her hands steady. She rowed as she breathed, calmly, confidently. They approached the pier. The city was waiting. Everyone was waiting. Ree tied up the boat. Dan climbed onto the pier. Ree climbed up after him. She stood next to him, close, shoulder to shoulder. She didn't hug him. She just stood there, next to him. Haena ran up. She grabbed her jacket, pulled it on, said she was soaking wet. "Thank you." She snorted, turned away. The rifle was on her back. She walked over to Dan. She said the shot wasn't necessary.
Dan said he was glad. Sora said she'd received a message from the Silent Corps. Her sister is walking, 3rd day, on her own, without help. She looked at Dan through the cracked glass. Then she took off her glasses, looked at the crack, then at Dan, and snapped the glasses in half, tossed them in her pocket, said she'd order new ones, without a crack. Leila stood slightly to the side, a stamped piece of paper in her hand, wet. She folded it and put it away. She looked at the water, at the clear blue water of the bay. She said that tomorrow morning she would issue an arrest warrant for Iona Westmore. Sabotage, water contamination, bribery, ties to the cult of the deep. She had heard it all, every lie from every witness, and now she has proof. Chen moored the boat. He climbed onto the pier. He walked over to the workbench on the pier where he'd left his harpoon that morning. He picked it up, heavy, old, scarred. He looked at Dan, said, "Teach me, I'm ready." Dan nodded. The next day, 6 students were sitting in the workshop. Marcus, Nico, June, 2 hunters, and May, 10 years old, with a fly in her pocket. The 14th, the best one. She showed it to Dan. He looked at it. Neat knots, the right feather, a clean hook, a good fly. It'll get a bite. He said that tomorrow they'd go out on the water together, May and Dan, and May would cast her fly, for Mom. May clenched the fly in her fist. She nodded, serious. A 10-year-old girl with a fishing rod in the future. Dan stepped out onto the porch. Ree was standing there, waiting. He stood beside her. They looked out at the bay, blue, clear, alive. Tiny 4-eyed fish were leaping out of the water by the pier, catching gnats, splashing. Life was returning. Ree said there was no sign above the warehouse door. "We need one." Dan asked what kind. Ree said to ask Haena. Haena had already carved it, a wooden sign, uneven letters, crooked, like May's first fly, but legible. "Quiet water. We fish for someone." Dan took the sign, nailed it above the door. Ree stood beside him. Haena stood nearby. Ember peeked out from the basement. Sora stood on the roof. Marcus walked along the pier to his morning workout. Chong-Mi was opening the bar across the street and humming. Leila was walking to court with a folder of documents. May ran toward the warehouse with a fly in her fist. Dan stood beneath the sign and felt a compass in his chest. East. The first source. The answers are there. The secret of the fishing rod is there. The language he began to speak is there. But that's later. Right now, it's morning. Right now, 6 students are waiting. Right now, May needs a fly for her mom. Right now, Ree is standing next to him, her shoulder touching his. The fishing rod in his hand is warm. 7 symbols. 7 words in a language he doesn't know yet. But he's learning. Just as he spent 20 years learning to read the river. Just as he taught Han how to cast.
just as he taught May how to tie knots. Slowly.
Patiently, knot by knot, cast after cast, fish after fish, person after person, Dan Markett, fisherman, catching for someone. The water waits.